The city of Rome was never truly silent. Even in its calmest nights, the stones themselves seemed to breathe. Under a sky washed pale by the moon, the great city shimmered, domes, temples, and columns standing like frozen prayers to forgotten gods. The Tiber drifted through the darkness like a mirror of silver, carrying whispers from the heart of an empire that ruled the known world. But this night was different. The air carried something heavy, a feeling that something sacred was ending. In the imperial palace, torches flickered against marble walls carved with triumphs of war and conquest. Statues of emperors stared down with hollow eyes as if they, too, knew that their power was only borrowed. Inside a vast chamber, the emperor sat alone before a dying fire. His crown lay beside him, heavy, unnecessary. He had called for the oracle, an old woman who lived beyond the city's edge, said to speak the words of the gods themselves. Few believed her anymore, but still he waited. Rome's enemies were gathering at its borders, its people restless, its faith divided. And in times like these, even emperors listened for omens. The door creaked open. 2 guards entered, their armor clinking softly. Between them walked a figure wrapped in a faded cloak. Her steps were slow, but her presence filled the room like the scent of earth after rain. When she lowered her hood, her face was lined and pale, eyes clouded like the surface of old glass. Yet in those eyes burned something ancient, the look of someone who had seen beyond human years. The emperor rose, the firelight dancing across his face. "You are the oracle of Cumae?" he asked. "I am what remains," she replied. Her voice was rough, trembling but steady in its truth. "The voices are faint now, my lord. The gods grow tired of speaking." The emperor's expression faltered. "Then tell me," he said, almost a whisper, "what do they say of Rome?" The old woman stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the floor like a spreading crack. She touched the marble beneath her feet, tracing the patterns as if feeling for something beneath. Then she lifted her head. "They say the ground will open," she murmured. "The earth will swallow its gods, and the city of men will fall. When the temples crumble into dust, the empire of the world will be as nothing." Her words fell like stones into a still lake. The chamber was silent except for the faint hiss of the fire. The emperor's hand trembled slightly. "Nonsense," he said after a moment, forcing a smile. "Rome is eternal." But the oracle only looked at him with pity, a look not of defiance, but of mourning. "Even eternity," she said, "has an ending." Outside, thunder rolled across the distant hills. A wind rose from the east, brushing through the palace gardens, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Somewhere far beyond the city, a temple roof groaned under the strain of time. The statue of a god, its face worn smooth by centuries, cracked at its base. A fragment fell, shattering against the stone floor below, a small sound, lost in the night, but one that echoed deeper than anyone knew. In the streets, priests performed their rituals, merchants packed their goods, soldiers sharpened their blades. Life went on as if the empire were invincible. Yet beneath that rhythm, something invisible shifted. Rumors began to spread that the oracle had spoken, that the gods had turned their faces away. In taverns and markets, people whispered of omens, of birds flying backward, of wells running dry, of strange lights seen above the hills. Most laughed it off. Rome had survived worse. But others, older and more weary, looked to the horizon and said nothing. In the temple of Jupiter, where the Sibylline books were once kept, a priest knelt before the altar. He prayed for guidance, but the air felt empty. The sacred flame flickered, hesitated, then went out. He stared in horror. the smoke twisting upward like a dying breath. Somewhere deep inside, he knew, the silence of the gods had begun. Back in the palace, the emperor dismissed the oracle, though her words haunted him long after she was gone. He dreamt that night of marble pillars cracking like bones, of statues weeping black tears, of the great city sinking beneath the earth as its people cried to the heavens. When he awoke, he found his chamber cold and still. The fire had died, and through the open window, dawn light spilled across the floor like the pale glow of something ending. Far below, the streets of Rome stirred to life. Children ran past monuments older than memory. Vendors called out prices and voices filled with routine certainty. Yet the emperor, standing by the window, could not shake the feeling that every sound, every footstep, every prayer, every echo was part of something final. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun rose above the ancient hills. The city gleamed under its light, perfect and proud, as though untouched by time. But somewhere in the distance, the oracle's voice seemed to whisper through the wind, soft, fading, but unmistakable. When the earth swallows its gods, Rome will fall. And though the emperor tried to forget, Rome itself had already begun to listen. Long before the name of Rome was ever carved into stone, people looked to the heavens for meaning. In a world without certainty, where storms could erase a village overnight and the ground itself could tremble without warning, humanity turned to the unseen. They built altars to what they feared and offered prayers to what they hoped might listen. From the sands of Egypt to the mountains of Greece, one belief echoed again and again, that the gods did not speak in words, but in signs. And somewhere among those signs, there were those rare few who could understand. The oracle was never simply a person. She was a bridge between realms. The Greeks called her Pythia, the mouthpiece of Apollo. Others called her Sibyl, a name that came to mean divine madness. To the people of the ancient world, her voice was not her own. It was the wind through the mouth of a cave, the murmur of smoke rising from sacred earth. When she spoke, kings trembled and wars paused. For in her trembling voice, destiny itself was said to be revealed. Yet the language of the gods was never direct. It came wrapped in riddles, in phrases so tangled that only the desperate could find clarity in them. "You will destroy a great empire," said one oracle to a proud king before battle. And he did, though it was his own. The gods, it seemed, delighted in ambiguity. Their language demanded interpretation, and interpretation demanded power. Over centuries, a priestly class emerged to guard and translate these cryptic messages. They watched the skies, listened to thunder, studied the entrails of sacrificed animals, and charted the flights of birds. Every sound, every flicker of fire, every twist of smoke carried meaning. It was not superstition to them, it was order. The divine was not chaos, but pattern, a rhythm only the wise could hear. To know that rhythm was to hold dominion over fate itself. The Greeks built temples at places where the veil between worlds seemed thinnest, near springs, mountains, and cracks in the earth where vapors rose like breath from the underworld. People traveled for weeks, sometimes months, to kneel before a trembling woman seated on a tripod above a sacred pit. She would breathe in the fumes, close her eyes, and speak in broken tones. Behind her, priests would write, translate, and interpret. What emerged was not merely advice, it was decree. For some, it was a comfort. For others, a curse. To ask the gods a question was to surrender to their truth, whatever it might be. The Greeks believed that even to remain silent before prophecy was dangerous. Ignoring divine speech could invite misfortune worse than death. The gods were jealous of indifference. And so, City after city wove oracles into their politics, their warfare, and their daily lives. When to sow crops, when to declare war, when to wed, when to build, all of it was weighed against the voices of the divine. But in that sacred dependence, another power took root, the power of those who interpreted the gods. Kings ruled armies, but the oracles ruled time. A single phrase from Delphi could shape the destiny of nations. And though many believed that the gods spoke through human lips, others began to suspect that perhaps it was the other way around, that prophecy was a human invention cloaked in divine mystery. Still, no one dared to say it aloud. As empires rose and fell, the language of the gods evolved, passing from one civilization to the next like a secret inheritance. In ancient Lydia, the oracle at Sardis was said to have predicted the wealth and ruin of Croesus. In Asia Minor, whispers from the caves of Claros guided travelers and kings alike. To question the oracle was to question the foundation of belief itself. Even skeptics sought her counsel, unable to escape the deep fear that the gods might still be listening. The Romans watched all this with fascination. They admired Greek wisdom, but mistrusted its unpredictability. To them, divination had to serve the state. They began to systematize it, to turn the chaos of the divine into something measurable. The sacred chickens that decided battle, the augurs who read the sky, the Sibylline scrolls kept locked beneath the temple of Jupiter, all of it formed a network of divine bureaucracy. Rome had found a way to organize even the gods. But in doing so, something shifted. The language of the divine, once wild and alive, began to wither under rules and politics. The sacred became procedure. The priest became a clerk of the unseen. What had once been the voice of mystery became the voice of empire, and with it came both glory and blindness. Still, beneath the marble and order, the old whispers continued. Travelers from the east brought new prophecies, darker and stranger than before. Some spoke of a kingdom without end, others of fire that would consume the world. And though the senators laughed and the generals scoffed, a few among them listened carefully, because deep down they knew something the Greeks had always understood, that prophecy was never about the gods. It was about people, about their fear of time, their hunger for control, and their desperate need to believe that someone, somewhere, still held the script of fate. As the world moved toward Rome's rise, the oracle's voices spread like echoes across the Mediterranean. Every empire believed it was chosen, that its reign was written in the heavens. But prophecy is a mirror, not a map, and every reflection eventually fades. Soon, the oracles would speak again, this time in Latin, not Greek. And when they did, their words would no longer belong to wandering priestesses or mountain caves. They would belong to emperors. Rome was learning a new truth, that whoever controls the language of the gods controls the destiny of men. At the edge of Mount Parnassus, where the rocks burn golden under the sun and the air tastes of salt and pine, lies a place that once held the ear of the gods. The Greeks called it Delphi, the center of the world, the navel of the earth. To stand there was to stand where heaven and earth were believed to touch, where the breath of Apollo himself rose from the ground to speak through mortal lips. It was said that even the winds changed direction when the oracle spoke. Travelers came from every corner of the known world to this sacred slope. Kings came clothed in purple and gold, peasants in rags and dust. They climbed the winding road past treasuries built by city-states competing for the gods' favor. The air was heavy with incense and anticipation. At the top stood the great temple of Apollo, its columns gleaming white against the mountain shadow. Beneath it lay the fissure, a dark, whispering mouth in the stone, from which vapors rose in a constant, trembling stream. There, on a bronze tripod, suspended above the earth, sat the Pythia, the priestess chosen to speak for the god. She was not a queen or a scholar, but a woman of ordinary birth. When she entered the trance, she left herself behind. She chewed laurel leaves, drank from the holy spring, and inhaled the sweet, heavy gas that drifted from below. Her body trembled, her eyes rolled back, and her voice changed, sometimes calm and melodic, sometimes frantic, broken, and filled with terror. Those who heard her swore it was not the woman who spoke, but something far older. To the Greeks, Delphi was the pulse of divine truth. They called it the omphalos, the earth's heart. It was here that Apollo's voice declared that nothing in life was more sacred than self-knowledge. Carved on the temple's entrance were two words that became eternal: know thyself. Yet those who came here rarely sought wisdom for the soul. They came for answers, for reassurance, for victory, for permission to act. They wanted certainty from the uncertain. The priests who stood beside the Pythia were interpreters of chaos. Her utterances poured out like storms, strange, fragmented, impossible to grasp. They listened, wrote, and shaped them into poetry. What left her lips as madness emerged as riddle. You will go, you will return, not die in war. A single misplaced comma could mean triumph or disaster. And still they believed. The power of prophecy lay not in precision, but in faith. The oracle did not predict the future. She made it inevitable. One legend tells of Croesus, the king of Lydia, who sent emissaries to test the oracle's power. He asked what he would be doing on the 100th day from their departure. The answer returned, "You will boil a tortoise and a lamb in a bronze cauldron." When the messengers arrived home, they found him doing exactly that. Astonished, Croesus asked whether he should wage war against Persia. The oracle replied, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." Confident, he marched, and it was his own empire that fell. Such stories spread like wildfire, giving Delphi an authority no army could match. City-states consulted it before founding colonies, choosing leaders or entering war. Even philosophers and poets came seeking approval for their ideas. For over 1,000 years, the breath of Apollo guided Greece through triumph and ruin alike. But behind the incense and reverence lay mystery, one that has haunted scholars ever since. How did a single woman, year after year, enter trances so deep, her voice changing beyond recognition? For centuries, it was believed to be divine possession. But in the modern age, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary beneath Delphi's ruins: a web of geological fault lines running directly under the temple. Chemical analysis revealed traces of ethylene gas, a natural hallucinogen that, in the right concentration, induces euphoria, dizziness, and visions. The ancients, unknowingly or not, had built their holiest shrine atop a vent of the earth itself. Perhaps that was no accident. Perhaps the Greeks, more intuitive than we admit, felt that the gods dwelled in places where the earth breathed. To them, it was not mere geology, but divine geography, a sacred design woven into the living rock. And maybe that was the true miracle of Delphi. Not that Apollo spoke from the depths, but that humans learned to listen to the language of the planet itself. As centuries passed, Delphi became more than a sanctuary. It became an empire of faith. The priests grew wealthy. The Pythia revered beyond royalty. Gold offerings filled the treasuries, each one a plea to the divine. Yet with power came corruption. Rival city-states tried to buy prophecy, bribing interpreters for favorable omens. Battles were fought over who controlled access to the god's voice. Even truth became a currency. Still, pilgrims continued to climb the mountain, their hearts heavy with questions. Mothers asked about their unborn children, soldiers about victory, merchants about fortune. And each time, the Pythia inhaled the sacred breath, her body trembling as if the earth itself moved through her. She spoke, and her words rippled outward, shaping decisions, altering fates. The empires that rose and fell across the Mediterranean did so under the shadow of her voice. But every voice fades. The fissures still exhaled, the mountains still hummed, but something changed in the hearts of men. A new power was rising across the sea, one that sought not the whisper of the gods, but the order of reason and empire. Rome was coming, and with it, the oracles of the world would soon find themselves bound not to the wild breath of Apollo, but to the will of emperors. For now, though, Delphi still breathed. The temple glowed at dawn, the air alive with hymns and hope. The world believed that as long as Apollo's voice spoke from the stone, Greece would endure. Yet deep beneath the marble floor, the gases shifted, the fissure narrowed, and the earth's breath began to falter. The gods were still speaking, but fainter now, as though even they sensed that their time was running out. When Rome first began its rise from a cluster of hilltop villages into an empire of marble and iron, it was not the sword that guided its destiny, but silence, the silence that came before an omen. Every Roman, from the humblest farmer to the highest general, believed that the gods did not speak through miracles, but through signs. The rustle of leaves, the pattern of lightning, the cry of a raven at dawn, all these were messages. The world was a language, and Rome learned to read it. But unlike the Greeks, who sought their truth in the ecstatic voices of priestesses and the trembling fumes of Apollo, the Romans made divinity into discipline. They were not content to wait for visions. They built systems to summon them. Prophecy became not a mystery, but a method, a bureaucracy of the sacred. They believed that if the gods ruled the universe, then understanding their will was an act of duty, not of wonder. At the heart of this belief stood the augurs, priests trained to interpret the heavens. Before any war, any law, any foundation of a city, the augur would raise his staff, the lituus, and mark a square of sky. Within that invisible frame, he watched the flight of birds, their direction, their number, their cries. A single crow flying left could delay a battle. An eagle circling right could crown a king. This was not superstition to Rome. It was protocol binding as law. No legion would march until the sky itself had given consent. Beside them worked the haruspices, men of Etruscan origin, grim and solemn, who sought knowledge in the entrails of sacrificed animals. They would slice open the body of a sheep or ox and study its organs with ritual precision. The shape of a liver, the color of its lobes, the texture of its veins, each carried meaning. To a Roman eye, it was as though the gods had written their decrees upon living flesh. To misread them was to invite disaster. And then there were the Sibylline books, the sacred scrolls of prophecy that would become both Rome's greatest treasure and its most dangerous secret. Their legend began long before the empire's glory, in the reign of Tarquinius Superbus, the last of Rome's kings. One day, an old woman appeared before the king, carrying 9 volumes. She claimed they contained the future of Rome, the destiny of its rise and fall. She offered to sell them for a price so high that Tarquin laughed. Without a word, the woman threw 3 of the books into the fire. Then she offered the remaining 6 for the same price. Again he refused, and again she burned 3. Finally, with only 3 left, Tarquin hesitated. His advisors urged him to buy them, and at last he did, for the original sum. The woman handed him the charred scrolls, then vanished. Some said she was the Cumaean Sibyl herself, a voice of the gods in mortal form. Those 3 books were placed in the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, guarded by priests who consulted them only in moments of absolute crisis. No one outside that circle knew what they contained. They were written in Greek verse, cryptic and symbolic, said to reveal not single fates, but the grand rhythm of history itself. When pestilence struck, when famine spread, when omens darkened the sky, the Senate sent for the keepers of books. In candlelit silence, they would unroll the scrolls and read the words aloud, seeking instruction. Sometimes the oracle demanded sacrifices, sometimes the building of temples, sometimes restraint from war. And so, over centuries, prophecy became a quiet thread woven into the fabric of Roman governance. But Rome was never satisfied with faith alone. It needed control. Every sign, every ritual, every prayer was recorded, cataloged, and supervised by law. The College of Augurs held as much influence as the Senate itself. Their readings could determine the fate of emperors. And yet, for all their reverence, there was calculation in their devotion. Prophecy became politics. When the gods were silent, men filled the void with their own voices. Still, the fear of divine displeasure lingered in every decision. Even Julius Caesar, who prided himself on reason, delayed crossing the Rubicon until the omens were read. He ignored the warnings of the soothsayer who told him to beware the Ides of March. And his murder in the Senate itself became a story whispered as divine punishment. To defy fate was to invite the gods to balance the scales. Rome's strength lay in its conviction that destiny could be managed. Yet beneath that order was unease, a deep, unspoken awareness that the gods were not truly under Roman control. The more the empire expanded, the more unpredictable the world became. Plagues, earthquakes, eclipses, each was read as a message. Priests debated meanings, senators argued, and the people prayed. But the truth was always the same. The gods spoke in their own time and in their own way. As centuries passed, the rituals grew heavier, more elaborate, less sincere. The augurs read skies that no longer moved them. The haruspices studied lifeless entrails without faith. The empire's heart still beat, but faintly, like an echo of belief long past. Rome had learned to listen, but not to understand. And somewhere across the sea, in the shadow of Cumae, the old woman who had sold the future was said to still wander the coast, her body bent with age, her eyes clouded with smoke. Travelers claimed to hear her voice carried on the wind, murmuring verses of warning, her words lost between waves and time. In the Senate, the books she left behind remained sealed. No one dared destroy them. They were the memory of the gods, and perhaps the map of Rome's end. For as the empire grew and the gods fell silent, Rome began to rely on those prophecies not as guidance, but as reassurance. And that, the Sibyl had once warned, was the first step toward forgetting how to listen at all. When the Roman Empire reached its golden age, it seemed as if nothing in the world could rival its might. Roads stretched across continents, cities gleamed with marble and bronze, and legions marched in perfect order beneath banners of the eagle. But even as Rome's power expanded outward, its soul turned inward, listening for whispers it could not silence. Because power, no matter how absolute, always brings with it the fear of its own collapse. And in that fear, people begin to hear things. In the heart of the empire, where senators debated beneath vaulted ceilings and philosophers argued in shaded courtyards, prophecy evolved once more. It became less about the voices of gods and more about the patterns of fate. The Romans began to see history as a cycle, a grand wheel that lifted civilizations only to crush them again. This belief, subtle and unsettling, crept into their art, their politics, even their dreams. Every triumph carried an echo of warning. Every victory parade was shadowed by the quiet certainty that glory never lasts. Whispers began to move through the streets of Rome, not from temples or priestly rituals, but from the people themselves. Merchants swore that strange comets burned in the sky before great disasters. Soldiers told tales of ghosts walking the battlefields of distant provinces, whispering in languages no one remembered. Farmers spoke of blood-red rain, of statues that wept, of thunder that rolled even beneath clear skies. The empire had learned to listen to signs, but now the signs multiplied beyond meaning. The divine language had become a chorus of fear, and so new interpreters rose to meet the demand. Prophets who claimed to hear celestial music, visionaries who said the dead spoke to them, dream readers who could predict the outcome of wars. Some are charlatans, clever and theatrical. Others were consumed by what they claimed to see. In dimly lit rooms filled with smoke, they whispered secrets of Rome's destiny to senators, generals, and emperors alike. The powerful were drawn to them not out of faith, but desperation, because even emperors dream, and in those dreams, the empire sometimes fell. Augustus, the first emperor, is said to have consulted oracles before every major decision. He built temples not merely to honor gods, but to anchor fate itself. He knew that Rome's power was fragile, that the gods could turn away at any time. Later, when Nero ruled, an emperor haunted by paranoia and madness, prophecy became both weapon and curse. He executed astrologers who predicted his downfall, then sought others to tell him it would never come. The more he tried to silence the future, the louder it spoke. In the provinces, older beliefs began to merge with Rome's rituals. Egyptian mystics whispered of the cycles of Ra. Mesopotamian scholars translated omens from clay tablets, and Celtic druids spoke of stars that foretold empires' deaths. The world's ancient languages of prophecy began to intertwine, forming something new, a global superstition carried by trade routes and conquests. The empire had not just conquered nations, it had inherited their ghosts. The strangest of all whispers came from Judea, a small and restless province at the edge of Rome's dominion. There, prophets walked barefoot through deserts, proclaiming visions of a new kingdom that would outlast all others. One voice in particular began to echo through the empire, a quiet, defiant voice that spoke not of emperors or auguries, but of truth, sacrifice, and resurrection. Rome dismissed it as rebellion, but it spread, carried by slaves, merchants, and travelers, until it reached the very heart of the capital. As centuries turned, this voice became a new faith, Christianity, and it began to reshape the empire's soul from within. The old gods fell silent. The augure's skywatch faded into history. In their place came crosses, prayers, and a promise of eternal life. Yet even this faith carried the old hunger for prophecy. Visions of apocalypse, of final judgment, replaced the omens of Jupiter and Mars. The empire had traded one divine language for another, but the need to hear the future had not died. It had merely changed its name. By the time the Western Empire began to crumble, its cities in ruin and its borders overrun, prophecy had become both comfort and despair. People whispered that Rome had fulfilled the Sibyl's ancient warnings, that every empire must fall as the stars decree. Some claimed to see omens in the smoke rising from the burned cities, others in the darkened sky where once the eagles flew. Yet even in its fall, Rome did not forget how to listen. Monks preserved its histories, scholars copied its texts, and mystics searched its ruins for signs of what would come next. The empire's body was broken, but its voice, that quiet, relentless whisper of destiny, survived. In time, those whispers would find new ears in distant lands. Kings, crusaders, and dreamers would listen as Rome once did, seeking to know if their empires too would rise and fall in the rhythm of fate. For prophecy, once born, never truly dies. It only changes shape, like an echo moving through time, searching for the next empire willing to listen. Long before the fall of Rome became a rumor whispered in the streets, before generals dreamed of betrayal and emperors looked to the stars for mercy, there were women who spoke with the voices of gods. They were the Sibyls, priestesses, oracles, and vessels of something far older than the empire itself. Their words were neither sermons nor speeches. They were fragments of revelation, carved into the bones of history. And those centuries would twist their meaning. Their prophecies carried one truth that Rome could never escape: that all empires are built beneath a shadow. The Sibyls were not confined to one place or creed. From Delphi to Cumae, from the burning deserts of Libya to the forests of Erythrae, they appeared in different forms but shared a single burden: the unbearable weight of knowing. Legend says they could see the weaving of fate but not change it. They were not worshipped like goddesses, nor trusted like scholars. They were feared. Their temples were places of silence, where incense curled like smoke from burning worlds, and the air trembled with unseen voices. The most famous of them all was the Cumaean Sibyl, an ancient woman said to dwell in a cave near the Bay of Naples. She was said to have lived for 1,000 years, her body withering as her wisdom grew. According to myth, she approached the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, carrying 9 books that contained the destiny of the Roman state. When he refused her price, she burned 3 of them before his eyes. When he hesitated again, she burned 3 more. Finally, terrified, he bought the remaining 3 at her original price, and thus began the legend of the Sibylline books. These books were not ordinary texts. They were said to contain riddles, warnings, and divine instructions that guided Rome in times of crisis. They were kept locked away in the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, guarded by priests who alone could read their cryptic verses. When earthquakes shattered cities, or plagues swept through the streets, or enemies gathered on Rome's borders, the Senate would turn to these prophecies for counsel. The words of the Sibyls became the voice of the gods, and the fate of the empire began to dance to their rhythm. But prophecy is a double-edged sword. The more Rome depended on the Sibylline books, the more it feared them. Their verses were written in strange, ambiguous phrases, words that could mean salvation or doom, depending on who read them. Politicians learned to twist them to their advantage, declaring divine approval for wars or rulers. The god's voice became a tool of power. Yet beneath the politics and manipulation, there lingered an older truth. The Sibyl's warnings were not about victory. They were about decay. One prophecy, whispered through generations, spoke of a city of iron and blood that would crumble into dust when the gods turned away. Another foretold a new kingdom rising from the ashes of the old, born not of marble, but of faith. Centuries later, Christians would point to these words as proof that the Sibyls had foreseen the coming of Christ. Pagan scholars, however, saw in them a vision of Rome's collapse. And perhaps both were right. The future the Sibyls saw was not a single event, but a transformation. One empire dying so another could be born. Over time, the Sibyls themselves became myth, their human lives swallowed by the legends they inspired. Artists painted them with eyes like storm clouds and lips half open in divine trance. Poets described their voices as thunder breaking through stone. The Romans, even as they built temples and armies, never stopped fearing them, because to listen to the Sibyls was to glimpse the inevitable, and to realize that no matter how great the empire, it too was mortal. The destruction of the Temple of Jupiter in 83 BCE marked a turning point. Fire consumed the sacred texts, and with them, perhaps, the last true warnings of Rome's future. Some claimed fragments were saved, hidden by priests who feared what the loss would mean. Others believed the Sibylline books had fulfilled their purpose, that prophecy had withdrawn its light, leaving Rome to face its destiny blind. Yet the idea of the Sibyl could not be burned away. She returned again and again, in new guises and stories. When Virgil wrote his Aeneid, he placed the Sibyl at the heart of Rome's origin, guiding Aeneas through the underworld and showing him visions of his descendants, the future emperors of Rome, the wars, the triumphs, and the tragedies. Her prophecy was not just about empire. It was about the soul of humankind, caught between ambition and fate. Even in the Christian era, long after temples had fallen silent, the Sibyl's words echoed. Early church fathers debated their meaning, claiming they had predicted the birth of Christ centuries before it happened. Medieval artists painted the Sibyls alongside the prophets of Israel in cathedrals, their ancient faces illuminated by stained glass. Their pagan voices had become part of a new divine chorus, as if even the old gods had bowed to the coming of a new order. But some whispered that not all of the Sibylline prophecies were fulfilled, that a final verse remained, one too terrible to reveal. It spoke, they said, of a great empire reborn, and of an age when humankind would once again seek to read the future in the ashes of the past. Perhaps it was only legend, or perhaps, as history has always shown, prophecy never dies, it only waits. And somewhere, beneath the ruins of ancient Rome, in the shadows of forgotten temples and buried libraries, the ghost of the Sibyl still waits too, watching, whispering, waiting for the next empire to listen. In the heart of the empire, Rome burned with glory, but beneath that marble brilliance, the fires of doubt had already begun to glow. The streets glittered with triumph, yet every triumph demanded sacrifice. The temples were filled with gold, but the gods had grown silent. And as the empire's reach stretched across oceans and deserts, its people began to feel something ancient stirring beneath the surface, a sense that destiny itself was shifting. By the time of Emperor Augustus, Rome stood at a crossroads. It was no longer a republic ruled by the will of its people, but an empire shaped by one man's vision, or perhaps by something that moved through him. Augustus understood the importance of symbolism. He restored temples, revived old rituals, and declared that the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was not merely political but divine. In his reign, omens and prophecy were as important as legions and laws. He claimed that his rise had been foretold by the stars, and the poets of his age, especially Virgil, made certain that this story would endure. But what few understood was that Rome's obsession with prophecy had transformed into a quiet paranoia. Every eclipse, every earthquake, every strange birth was seen as a message. The empire had learned to listen for omens, but it had forgotten how to live without them. Priests and seers multiplied, their temples crowded with anxious citizens desperate to know if the gods still favored them. The air itself seemed charged with expectation, as if the world were holding its breath. Then came the first great fire. In 64 CE, Under Emperor Nero, flames devoured the heart of Rome for 9 days. The marble city turned to ash. The sky glowed red above the Tiber. People fled into the countryside, weeping, praying, cursing the heavens. Whispers spread like smoke that Nero himself had set the fire, that he had watched the city burn while playing his lyre. Others claimed it was divine punishment, the fulfillment of a Sibylline prophecy long forgotten. Nero, desperate to shift the blame, turned to the growing Christian sect, accusing them of treason and blasphemy. Thousands were rounded up, tortured, executed, their deaths meant to silence fear, but instead deepening it. Because even as the flames died, new rumors rose. The gods, they said, had abandoned Rome. The old temples stood empty. Sacrifices no longer brought favor. The empire had grown too proud, too vast, too defiant of heaven. In the shadows of Nero's palaces, the old oracles fell silent. Many were executed, accused of treasonous prophecy. The Sibylline books, now interpreted by state-appointed priests, offered only confusion, riddles that contradicted one another. Some senators began to whisper that the real danger was not rebellion or plague, but fate itself. Rome had begun to dream of its own destruction. As Nero's reign descended into madness, new omens appeared. A comet blazed across the sky, so bright it was seen across the empire. Floods swept through the provinces, statues cracked, lightning struck temples. To the Romans, these were not coincidences, they were declarations. The gods were angry, and the emperor's fall was near. And fall he did. In 68 CE, Nero took his own life, abandoned by his guards, muttering that the world would lose a great artist with his death. His suicide marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of Rome's descent into chaos. Civil war erupted as generals fought for the throne. For the first time in living memory, the empire seemed to lose its divine protection. The people looked to the heavens and found no answer. In the years that followed, Rome rebuilt itself again and again, each emperor claiming to restore what the last had destroyed. The Colosseum rose from Nero's private gardens, a monument to power and control. But even in its splendor, the city remained haunted. Fires returned, not just of flame, but of rebellion, corruption, and faith. Christians grew in number, their quiet defiance spreading through every class. To them, prophecy meant hope, the promise of a new kingdom that would never fall. To Rome, it was a threat, a whisper of inevitable downfall. The empire began to fracture along invisible lines. Old religion against new, faith against fear, destiny against pride. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the last true oracles began to vanish. The Cumaean Sibyl, the Pythia of Delphi, the priestesses of Apollo, their temples fell silent one by one. The world had changed, but prophecy had not disappeared. It had merely gone underground, waiting for a time when men would need it again. Centuries later, when historians look back on Nero's fire, they saw not just the destruction of a city, but the first visible crack in Rome's illusion of immortality. The marble walls could be rebuilt, the forms restored, the legions reorganized, but the faith that had once held it all together was fading. Beneath the marble, beneath the empire's pride, something darker smoldered, the quiet fire of destiny, waiting for its chance to rise again. Because Rome's greatest enemy was never the barbarian, nor the traitor, nor the Christian. It was the future itself, the one thing the empire could not conquer, no matter how many times it tried to read its will. And somewhere, perhaps, the last of the Sibyls smiled in the dark, knowing that her prophecy had already begun. Rome believed itself eternal. Its poets declared it. Its emperors engraved it in stone. Its armies carried that certainty on their shields. The eternal city, they called it Urbs Aeterna, the light that would never dim, the empire that would outlast all others. But eternity is a dangerous dream, and for those who believe they have conquered time, prophecy becomes a mirror, one that shows not glory, but the shadow that follows it. By the 2nd century CE, the empire stood at the height of its power. Under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, Rome ruled from the misty coasts of Britain to the burning sands of Arabia. Roads stitched the world together like veins of stone. Grain from Egypt fed millions, and the Colosseum echoed with the roar of blood and spectacle. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, seemed unbreakable. But behind the marble facades, cracks were beginning to form, and those who looked too closely could already see what the future held. Hadrian, unlike many of his predecessors, was a thinker. He rebuilt temples, studied philosophy, and surrounded himself with scholars and astrologers. Yet even he could not escape the pull of fate. When his beloved Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile, Hadrian declared him a god, an act that scandalized the Senate and fascinated the people. He built statues, temples, and a cult in Antinous' name. Some said it was love. Others said it was an attempt to cheat death, to keep something of himself alive through divine power. But the whispers spread. The emperor had disturbed something sacred. Astrologers began predicting omens of doom. A blood moon appeared above Rome. A great plague swept through the provinces. Lightning struck the temple of Jupiter, splitting its golden roof. To the common people, these were not coincidences, they were warnings. The empire had grown too proud, too close to the divine fire it once served. The gods were no longer protectors, they were spectators. Yet Rome could not stop dreaming. Each new emperor declared that his reign would restore the Golden Age. Coins bore the words Aeternitas Augusti, the eternity of the emperor. Temples were built to time itself, as if by worshipping eternity, Rome could possess it. But the more the empire tried to fix itself in stone, the more fragile it became. Its borders grew restless, its legions weary, its people uncertain. Even its prophets, once revered, now spoke in whispers, afraid to offend the power they served. In the marketplaces, common folk repeated strange sayings. The empire will burn when the eagle forgets to fly, or when the sun sets twice in one day. The gods will turn their faces away. These phrases came from no known oracle, but they spread like wildfire, carried by fear. Rome had become addicted to the idea of destiny, but now that destiny was beginning to sound like a curse. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who ruled in the late 2nd century, tried to silence that fear. A man of reason, he believed that fate was simply nature, that every empire, like every man, must someday die. In his private writings, he confessed his doubts. All is change, he wrote. Even Rome. Yet when plague struck his armies and barbarians crossed the Danube, even he could not escape the feeling that something greater was unfolding, something foretold long before his time. The Sibylline books, long hidden in the capital, were said to contain warnings that matched the times. Some fragments, recovered and reinterpreted by scholars, spoke of a great sickness that will come when the iron of men outlasts the breath of gods. Others mentioned a world consumed not by fire, but by the hunger of men. These cryptic lines circulated quietly among the educated, but they carried an unbearable implication, that the empire's end would not come from outside invasion, but from within, from its own endless desire to endure. The empire's faith began to splinter. The old gods, once the heart of every festival and ceremony, were no longer enough. Mystery cults from the east spread across Rome. Worshippers of Isis, Mithras, and Cybele filled secret temples, seeking personal salvation instead of imperial glory. For the first time, belief became private, hidden, desperate. The empire had built its identity on certainty, but now its people prayed in shadows, afraid of what the future might bring. And then, one night, a great storm struck Rome. Lightning struck the statue of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, shattering its hand, the hand that once held thunder. Priests declared it an omen. The gods no longer held dominion. Others said it was a sign that man's empire had outgrown the divine. But a poet watching from the streets wrote something different, something that would be remembered for centuries. The marble has cracked. The god has dropped his weapon. Rome's heart still beats, but it beats against time. This was the beginning of the empire's long awakening, or its slow death. The people still believed in eternity, but deep inside, they began to suspect that eternity had never belonged to them. The dream that had built the empire was the same dream that would unmake it, the belief that man could master destiny. And somewhere, hidden in a crumbling library or buried beneath the ashes of an old temple, a forgotten prophecy stirred once more, a verse from the Sibylline text that few had dared to read aloud. When Rome believes it cannot fall, the gods will remind it that all stone turns to dust. That whisper, carried through time, was not a warning. It was a promise, because even the empire that dreamed of eternity would one day awaken and find eternity waiting to collect its due. By the 3rd century, the empire that once called itself eternal had begun to tremble. The marble monuments still stood, the legions still marched, but beneath the glittering surface, cracks widened like veins of darkness through a dying heart. The Senate clung to tradition, the emperors to their crowns, but the people had started listening again. Not to the Senate, not to generals or priests, but to prophecy. Because when power weakens, faith changes shape. It slips through the cracks and becomes something deeper, something desperate. Rome's obsession with omens had never vanished. It had merely grown quieter, hidden beneath politics and ceremony. But now, with plagues, famine, and endless wars tearing at the empire's body, it returned like an old ghost. Every whisper of thunder, every tremor in the earth, every strange birth or eclipse was interpreted as a sign. Markets buzzed with rumors. Soldiers claimed to have seen crimson rainfall on their camps. Farmers swore that statues wept. And in the shadows of the great cities, people began to seek out those who could make sense of it all. The prophets, the astrologers, the dream readers. Prophecy had become a trade again, but it was no longer the voice of the gods. It was the echo of fear. The empire's heart had grown divided. Emperors rose and fell with the seasons, each one proclaimed by soldiers, blessed by augurs, then betrayed by both. In a single 50-year span, more than 20 emperors would rule, and nearly all would die violently. The empire was drowning in its own reflection, and in that chaos, the oracles returned, not from temples, but from taverns, camps, and prisons. Some spoke of an age of iron and fire, where the world would be reborn through suffering. Others promised salvation through blood, claiming the empire's death would bring a new dawn. There were those who whispered of the Black Eagle, a symbol said to mark the empire's final emperor, whose reign would end with the stars falling from the sky. Most of these prophets were executed, their words scattered to silence. Yet their voices lingered, passed secretly from one listener to another, until they became part of the empire's very breath. The historian Cassius Dio wrote that in those years, even the most rational men carried charms against fate. Generals refused to march unless the omens were favorable. Emperors delayed coronations until the stars aligned. Philosophy and superstition had become inseparable. The empire's greatest minds, once devoted to reason and law, now spent their nights studying the movements of planets, searching for the hour of Rome's death. One emperor, Decius, attempted to restore the old order by reviving the ancient gods. He declared that every citizen must sacrifice to the traditional deities and receive proof in writing, a small certificate known as the libellus. To refuse was treason. To question was blasphemy. But this act only deepened the divide. Christians who refused to obey were hunted and killed in the thousands. Their steadfast faith became, in the eyes of the desperate, another kind of prophecy, one that promised a new kingdom beyond this crumbling world. The more the empire tried to silence prophecy, the louder it grew. Strange books circulated in secret. Oracula Sibyllina Nova, or New Sibylline oracles, filled with apocalyptic visions of fire, judgment, and the fall of empires. Some claimed they were written by Christians, others by pagans, but all spoke of the same fate, that Rome's greatness was built upon a ticking clock, and that its final hour had already been written. In the East, mystics began blending Greek philosophy with Persian dualism, creating hybrid religions that spoke of cosmic battles between light and darkness. These ideas spread quickly, carried by soldiers, traders, and slaves. By the time of Emperor Aurelian, the boundaries between religion and prophecy had blurred completely. He himself founded a new state cult, the worship of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a god of renewal and destiny. In the glow of this sun, the emperor proclaimed that Rome would rise again, purified and eternal. But even as he spoke, earthquakes shook the empire, and a new plague swept through its heart. The people began to whisper that perhaps even the sun itself had grown tired of Rome. Aurelian died at the hands of his own guards, betrayed by men who thought they were saving themselves from fate. His death felt like an echo, one more name carved into an unending list of emperors consumed by prophecy. Because that was what Rome had become, a machine that devoured its own destiny. Every new ruler was seen as the savior foretold. Every rebellion, the fulfillment of some forgotten omen. The empire was no longer guided by reason or law, but by the restless pulse of belief. In the chaos of those years, the lines between prophecy and madness blurred. Hermits wandered the countryside, muttering verses that no one understood. Statues were said to move at night. Strange lights flickered over battlefields. And somewhere, in the ruins of an old temple, a priest unearthed a fragment of a forgotten text. Its ink was faint, its meaning unclear, but one phrase stood out, a whisper across time. The empire that dreams of eternity will wake to find it gone. Perhaps it was a forgery. Perhaps it was real. It didn't matter. For the people of Rome, it was truth enough. They had begun to understand what the Sibyls had always known, that prophecy was not a gift, but a mirror. And in that mirror, the empire saw itself not as a mortal marble, but as flesh and dust. The veins of prophecy, once buried deep beneath Rome's grandeur, now ran openly through its streets. Every whisper, every rumor, every dream became part of a single heartbeat, the slow, rhythmic pulse of a dying empire that still believed it could outrun its fate. And somewhere beyond the walls, in the dark forests of the north and the endless deserts of the east, new voices were already rising. Voices that would one day fulfill the words the Sibyls had left behind. By the dawn of the 4th century, Rome was no longer the empire of marble Augustus had dreamed of, nor the burning engine of conquest that had once ruled the known world. It had become something darker, an empire of memory built upon the bones of its own past. The legions still marched, the senators still debated, but their words echoed through halls filled with ghosts. The light of civilization still flickered, but it was faint, trembling beneath the weight of centuries. The empire had grown too vast, too weary, too divided to remember what it was fighting for. In the streets of Rome, gold and decay walked hand in hand. Temples stood beside ruins, new churches beside empty baths. The Tiber carried the smell of smoke and salt. Merchants sold relics of old gods as trinkets. Soldiers guarded palaces while begging for pay that never came. The empire's heart beat on, but faintly, as if it was remembering, not living. Across the empire, a strange silence had begun to settle, not of peace, but of exhaustion. The old gods were fading, their temples abandoned, their names whispered only by the elderly who remembered when Jupiter still ruled the skies. In their place, a new faith had taken root, one born not in palaces, but in catacombs. Christianity, once a haunted belief, now spread like wildfire through the cracks of empire. It promised salvation not in marble or glory, but in endurance, in hope beyond death. To the poor, the broken, and the forgotten, this was not rebellion, it was resurrection. When Emperor Constantine rose to power, the world shifted again. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge was not just a clash of armies. It was the collision of two worlds. As the story went, Constantine looked to the sky before battle and saw a vision. A cross of light with the words in this sign, "Conquer." Whether divine revelation or political brilliance, the result was the same. The empire would now bear a new symbol. The eagle of Rome was joined by the cross of Christ. With that union, Rome's identity transformed. The empire that had once worshipped 1,000 gods now bent before one. Constantine's rule marked not only the birth of a new faith, but the twilight of an old civilization. The temples of Jupiter and Mars were emptied, their altars silent. In their place rose basilicas, vast and solemn, where the sound of hymns replaced the roar of sacrifices. The Roman world, once carved from conquest, was now reforged in faith. But shadows lingered beneath the light. Constantine's new empire was not one of harmony, but of quiet tension. Pagan philosophers whispered that the empire had lost its soul. Old priests spoke of curses unleashed by the abandonment of the gods. The streets were filled with debates, sometimes with blood. Was Rome still Rome if its gods were gone? Or had it become something else, a spirit wearing the skin of its former self? Meanwhile, prophecy had not vanished. It had merely changed tongues. Christian mystics now spoke of the end of days, of beasts rising from the sea, of trumpets sounding over the earth, of kingdoms that would fall and one that would last forever. The ancient Sibylline oracles were rewritten, baptized into new meaning. Where once they had spoken of Rome's destiny, they now warned of judgment and revelation. The empire of Caesar was becoming the empire of God, and with that transformation came a new kind of fear. The more the empire turned to faith, the more it felt the pull of its own shadow. Constantine founded a new capital, Constantinople, carved between two worlds, half in Europe, half in Asia. It was a city born from prophecy, built to outlive Rome itself. Its walls gleamed with marble and gold, but its foundation was laid upon a single truth, that empires die, but ideas can be reborn. In the deserts of Egypt, hermits withdrew from the world, seeking purity in solitude. In the forests of Gaul, monks built wooden crosses where once stood druid stones. Across Africa and the East, bishops argued over the nature of Christ, while in Rome, senators clung to their last fragments of privilege. The empire was not collapsing. It was transforming, molting its old skin in pain and silence. Yet, as light spread, so did darkness. The frontiers burned with rebellion. The Goths, the Vandals, and countless tribes gathered like storms beyond the horizon. Rome's armies, weakened and divided, could not hold them all back. The empire that had once conquered the world now feared the world beyond its walls. Inside those walls, people whispered again of omens. Statues cracked without reason. Strange fires burned over the sea. The heavens themselves seemed to shift. Scholars tried to explain, but the people already knew. Every empire ends, not when its enemies break it, but when its heart forgets why it beats. By the time Constantine died, the empire was two, east and west, shadow and light. His vision had saved it from immediate ruin, but had also divided it forever. Rome itself was still magnificent, but its soul now wandered elsewhere, carried eastward by the promise of eternity. The Empire's shadows was not yet dead. It still marched, still spoke, still dreamed. But its dreams had changed. It no longer dreamed of conquest or glory, but of survival, of outlasting the night. And as the century turned, that night began to fall. The barbarians were coming, the gods were silent, and the empire stood between two worlds, unsure which one it truly belonged to. And somewhere in the stillness of that uncertain dawn, a line from an old prophecy returned, one whispered by a dying oracle long ago. The empire that forgets its past will find no future. Rome had not forgotten, not yet, but the shadows were growing longer, and soon they would cover everything. In the twilight of Rome's glory, when marble cracked beneath ivy and the once mighty roar of the Forum was reduced to murmurs, the Sibyls were remembered again. Their words, once etched on fragile scrolls and guarded in temples, resurfaced in whispers across the empire. It was said that long ago, before kings or emperors, before even Rome itself had a name, 9 prophetic women had spoken of a destiny that would echo through eternity. Their verses were cryptic, tangled in symbols and riddles, but they had always pointed toward power and loss. By the 4th century, the ancient Sibylline books were already legend. The originals had been burned, rewritten, and reinterpreted 100 times. Yet fragments endured, copied by monks, guarded by priests, hidden by those who fear their truth. Some said the final copies were kept locked in the heart of Rome's temples, sealed away after a warning too dark to face. Others whispered that they had been taken east, smuggled into Constantinople by secret believers who thought the oracles spoke not of gods, but of men. The new Christian world wanted to forget them, but the Sibyls refused to die. Their prophecies began to reappear, woven into sermons, painted into churches, murmured by preachers who saw in them divine patterns. To some, they became saints of a different kind, pagan mouths speaking the language of God. To others, they were dangerous, relics of a world that refused to surrender. The line between faith and superstition blurred again. In hidden rooms, scholars compared the ancient verses to the events unfolding around them. One fragment spoke of the empire clothed in gold that will be stripped by fire. Another of the sun that rises in the east as the west turns to shadow. These were not mere coincidences. They seemed to describe the very world collapsing before their eyes. Constantine's shift of power, the rise of a new faith, the trembling of the empire's old heart, all of it felt foretold. Even the Christians could not ignore the uncanny resonance. Church fathers like Lactantius and Augustine found themselves quoting the Sibyls, cautiously reinterpreting their words as hidden signs of divine providence. If the Sibyls had once served Apollo, then perhaps Apollo had unknowingly served God. It was a dangerous argument, but a compelling one, that even the pagan prophets had been vessels for the same truth all along. The idea comforted some, terrified others. And then, a new prophecy began to spread. No one knew its true origin, perhaps a fragment of an older text, perhaps a forgery, perhaps something whispered by an unknown monk who had seen too much. It spoke of the city of 7 hills trembling as the northern wind descends, and a crimson dawn when the eagle forgets its cry. In Rome, these words spread like a fever. For many, they were dismissed as superstition. But for those who had seen omens, the eclipses, the comets, the collapsing temples, they were a warning. By now, the old religion was nearly gone. The Vestal Virgins had been disbanded, their sacred fire extinguished. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus stood empty, its altars covered in dust. But even as the empire turned its eyes toward heaven, some could not forget the past. Deep beneath the crumbling hills, in catacombs and forgotten chambers, fragments of marble and parchment still carried the verses of the Sibyls. Men and women came by candlelight to read them, not as acts of worship, but of remembrance. They searched those ancient words for meaning in a world they no longer recognized. Each verse seemed to carry a heartbeat from a vanished age. One described a queen who will mourn for her empire. Another spoke of the wolf's descendants devouring one another under a blood moon. These are not just metaphors. To the people of Rome, they felt like mirrors reflecting their own despair. The Sibyls had always spoken in riddles, but their power lay in this very ambiguity. Each generation found in them what it feared most. For the Romans of the crumbling 4th century, they were the voice of destiny itself, a reminder that no empire, no matter how divine it believed itself to be, could escape the turning of time. And then came the twist no one expected. The Christians began to claim the Sibyls as their own. In frescoes across the empire, the 12 Sibyls were painted beside the prophets of the Bible. Michelangelo himself, centuries later, would carve them into the Sistine Chapel, side by side with Isaiah and Daniel, as if to say that prophecy belonged not to one faith, but to all who listened. The Church, once fearful of pagan visions, had absorbed them, transforming them from heresy to holy mystery. But in the age of Constantine and his heirs, this blending was still dangerous. The emperors sought to control prophecy, to claim divine right for themselves. They commissioned scholars to interpret the oracles in ways that reinforced their power and to burn the rest. Yet even they could not silence the unease. Too many believed the Sibyls had already seen the end, not of Rome's enemies, but of Rome itself. As the empire's armies faltered and barbarian tribes drew nearer, the verses grew louder in the imagination of the people. The stone will fall upon the city of kings, one fragment warned, and from its ashes will rise a crown of thorns. To Christians, it sounded like Christ's triumph. To pagans, it was a curse. To the few who truly understood its depth, it was neither. It was the echo of a world realizing it had reached its prophecy. In the flickering light of fading Rome, one truth endured. Prophecy is not about the future, it is about recognition. The Sibyls had not merely predicted what would come. They had revealed what already was: the decay, the pride, the faith, the fear. They had held up a mirror to empire, and in it, Rome saw its own shadow. And as the people read their words by trembling candlelight, a single question lingered. Had the Sibyls been warning them for centuries, or had they been speaking to someone far beyond, to us, watching from the ruins of their world? The whisper of the Sibyls had returned, soft, ancient, unending. And somewhere, between faith and fate, the empire began to listen. As the 5th century dawned, the air around Rome grew heavy with a strange kind of silence. Not peace, but the stillness that comes before a storm. The empire stood vast in name, but hollow in truth. Its legions were thin, its coffers empty, and its rulers uncertain whether they served God or power. It was a time of uneasy faith, of trembling belief, and in that vacuum of certainty, the prophecies of fire and iron began to resurface. The whispers started at the edges of empire, among soldiers stationed on the Rhine, among monks in distant monasteries, among merchants returning from the East. Each told a slightly different version of the same tale, an ancient prophecy rediscovered, foretelling the fall of a city of marble, consumed by flame, brought low not by armies, but by its own corruption. It spoke of a people of iron clothed in fur, who will descend from the forests and claim the eagle's nest. The word spread like wildfire. To the frightened citizens of the West, they seemed to describe the barbarian tribes that now loomed beyond their crumbling borders. The Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, forces of chaos from lands Rome had never truly tamed. To the faithful, the prophecy was something deeper, a divine warning of judgment. To others, it was a spark of rebellion, proof that the gods had not been silenced, only waiting for their vengeance. In Constantinople, scholars tried to trace the prophecy's origin. Some claimed it came from the last remnants of the Sibylline verses, others from an Eastern mystic who had wandered west after the fall of Antioch. A few even said it had been written by a Roman general long dead, one who had foreseen the empire's betrayal from within. Whatever its source, it arrived at a time when Rome could least afford more ghosts. The West was faltering. The emperors changed faster than the seasons, each rising on promises of strength, each falling to intrigue or blade. Armies no longer fought for Rome. They fought for whoever could pay them. Even faith had become fractured. Bishops quarreled over doctrine, monasteries fought over relics, and the people, weary of sermons and taxes, began to turn once more to prophecy for hope. In taverns, in temples, in the smoky corners of markets, the words of the prophecy were repeated like prayer. When fire consumes the eagle's wings, the stone of the 7 hills shall weep. The stone was Rome. Everyone knew that. But the meaning of the fire and the wings divided them. Some said it was divine punishment. Others said it was the vengeance of those Rome had wronged. Still others whispered that the prophecy was not about destruction, but rebirth, that through ruin, Rome would be cleansed. It was around this time that a strange letter began to circulate, said to have been written by a Christian hermit from the East, a man who claimed to have seen visions of Rome's fall. He described rivers of flame cutting through the city, of marble statues crying blood, of the cross standing amid ashes. Whether the letter was real or forged mattered little. It captured the imagination of a terrified people. The prophecy had become more than words, it was an expectation. As Rome struggled to hold itself together, the Huns appeared, fierce, fast, unstoppable, led by a man whose name alone carried the weight of legend, Attila. To his enemies, he was the scourge of God. To his followers, the chosen hand of fate. His campaigns burned across Europe like lightning. Cities fell, kingdoms crumbled, and every victory seemed to confirm the prophecy's warning. Rome trembled. When Attila finally reached the gates of Italy, the people believed the end had come. Priests and peasants alike fled into the hills. The Emperor Valentinian III prayed to the heavens, promising anything to be spared. And then, something inexplicable happened. Attila stopped. He met with Pope Leo I, the Bishop of Rome, on the plains near Mantua. No one knows what was said between them. Some say the Pope offered gold, others that he offered prophecy. But Attila turned back. He spared Rome. To those who survived, this miracle did not end the fear. It deepened it. The prophecy had not been broken. It had only paused. Rome's reprieve was not mercy, they said, but delay, the eye of the storm. And indeed, only a few years later, the Vandals sailed across the Mediterranean and sacked the Eternal City. For 14 days, fire and iron consumed the heart of empire. Statues fell, temples were looted, churches desecrated. The eagle's wings had burned. The prophecy had come true. Yet, in a cruel twist, Rome did not die. It endured, wounded, humiliated, but breathing. Like a creature too stubborn to perish, it clung to existence. The people began to reinterpret the prophecy again. Perhaps this was not the final fire, they said. Perhaps the true end was still to come. Each generation found a new way to fit their fear into its verses, as though the words themselves were alive, reshaping with every crisis. Even as the Western Empire crumbled, Constantinople rose, claiming the legacy of Rome. The Byzantines saw themselves as eternal, chosen, invincible. They believed the prophecy belonged only to the fallen West, until earthquakes shook their walls and plagues darkened their streets. Then, even they began to wonder if the words spoke of them too. The prophecy of fire and iron had transcended time. It was no longer about geography or empire, but about human destiny itself, the cycle of power and decay, of pride and punishment. Every civilization carries its own prophecy, written not by gods, but by its own hands. Rome's was simply the first to be read aloud. And as the embers of the Western Empire cooled, a haunting truth began to take shape. Prophecy was never meant to predict the future. It was meant to remind us of the past. The same arrogance, the same blindness, the same faith in immortality that had doomed Rome could one day doom all who came after. The fire had burned once, but the iron, the will, the ambition, the endless hunger of mankind still remained. And in that iron, still glowing faintly beneath the ashes of empire, the next prophecy was already being forged. By the middle of the 5th century, Rome no longer commanded the awe of nations. It merely commanded their pity. The eternal city, once the beating heart of the world, had become a fading echo, a place of memories rather than might. Grass grew between the cobblestones of the Forum. The once golden statues of emperors stood dull and cracked. The Senate, reduced to a handful of weary men, still met in the Curia, but their voices carried no further than the walls that enclosed them. Outside, the people spoke not of laws or victories, but of omens. They said the earth had trembled beneath the 7 hills. They said a cross of fire had appeared in the sky. They said the statues of the old gods had fallen to their knees in the night. Whether truth or rumor, no one could tell, but belief, not fact, was what mattered now. The prophecy of fire and iron had already taken root in the Roman soul, and every earthquake, every eclipse, every thunderstorm seemed to confirm it. When the Vandals departed after their plunder, Rome was left hollow, both in spirit and in flesh. The temples stood as carcasses of an extinct faith. The churches stood scarred and blackened by smoke. The Tiber carried ashes downstream, as if the city itself had begun to dissolve. To the Christian chroniclers, this was divine chastisement, God's warning to a proud empire that had too long mistaken power for providence. To others, it was proof that the Sibylline verses were true, that fate itself had turned against them. Yet even now, the people clung to fragments of hope. They spoke of Rome's resilience, how it had survived the Gauls, Carthage, Nero, and countless disasters. Perhaps this too would pass. Perhaps the prophecy was exaggerated. But deep inside, no one believed that anymore. The empire's fall no longer felt like a possibility. It felt like a memory unfolding in real time. In 476 AD, the illusion ended. The final emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, a boy barely old enough to understand the weight of his crown, was deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. There was no grand battle, no thunderous rebellion. The end came quietly, like a candle burning out in an empty hall. The Roman Empire, the empire that had conquered the known world, built aqueducts that defied nature, and crowned itself as the ruler of civilization, had ceased to exist. It was an ending so subdued that few at the time realized its magnitude. The Senate still met. The people still called themselves Romans. Life continued, as if pretending could postpone the truth. But the truth was irreversible. The eagle had fallen, and the prophecy had been fulfilled. When the child of the wolf loses his crown, the Sibylline text had said, "The walls of the world will tremble." The boy emperor, descendant of Romulus, the mythical wolf's child, had indeed lost his crown. And with it, Rome's thousand-year dream had died. The chroniclers who lived through those years wrote with a strange detachment, as if afraid to touch the wound too closely. Some described the event not as a tragedy, but as a transformation, the passing of one age into another. The Christian writers, in particular, framed it as divine design. Rome's empire had been of the flesh. Now a greater spiritual empire was beginning, the empire of God. The fall of the earthly Rome was the rise of the heavenly one. Yet even among the faithful, there was unease. Had the prophecy truly meant that? Or had it warned that no empire, divine or mortal, was beyond ruin? In the monasteries that dotted the collapsing world, monks copied fragments of ancient texts, preserving what they could of history and prophecy. Some kept the old Sibylline verses beside the Gospels, believing both held truth. They wrote of the kingdom that was promised but not yet revealed, of the light that flickers even as the world falls to shadow. These lines blurred the boundary between apocalypse and hope, a tension that would haunt Europe for centuries. Outside the monasteries, the world was changing shape. The roads that once led to Rome now led nowhere. The aqueducts dried. The amphitheaters crumbled into silence. Across the provinces, barbarian kings rose from the ashes of empire, each claiming legitimacy through conquest or faith. The world had become smaller, darker, and in that darkness, the prophecies found new life. Every chieftain, every bishop, every mystic saw in the Sibyls and in the fall of Rome some reflection of themselves. The people spoke of omens still. They said the river Tiber had turned red at sunset. They said wolves had howled from the ruins of the Colosseum. They said a voice had been heard in the wind, repeating the same three words, Roma est morta. Rome is dead. Whether this was superstition or the desperate imagination of a grieving people, no one could prove. But grief needs no proof. For centuries, the world had believed Rome eternal, urbs aeterna. To see it fall was not just the loss of city, but the end of meaning itself. The collapse was so immense that even time seemed to pause, uncertain how to move forward. Historians later called it the fall, but in truth, it was a long fading, a slow surrender to inevitability. The empire had died, as all empires do, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small silences. And yet, even as the city burned, the idea of Rome refused to die. The monks who copied its chronicles, the bishops who invoked its legacy, the conquerors who dreamed of restoring its glory, all kept its ghost alive. Rome had become prophecy itself, an eternal symbol of rise and ruin, of power and decay. Its death was not an ending, but a warning written in stone. As the Western world sank into what would later be called the Dark Ages, one truth endured. The fall of Rome was not a mystery to be solved, but a mirror to be feared. It was not the failure of gods or armies, but of belief. The Sibyls had not cursed the empire. They had merely described the pattern that all human ambition follows. And somewhere beyond the ruins, beneath the stars that once guided its legions, the whisper returned, soft, ancient, merciless. The empire that forgets its soul will lose its crown. Rome had forgotten, and so it fell. But in that fall lay the seed of every civilization to come, each destined to rise, to rule, and, one day, to meet its prophecy. As the last ice age slowly loosened its grip on the earth, the world began to transform in ways our ancestors had never witnessed before. Vast sheets of ice that had once covered continents started to melt, releasing torrents of fresh water into the oceans and flooding ancient valleys that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years. The air grew warmer, forests began to creep northward, and the frozen tundra that had long defined human existence began to soften into new landscapes. Lush meadows, dense woods, and swelling rivers. It was a time of both rebirth and danger, a shifting world that offered new possibilities but demanded rapid adaptation. For the early humans who survived the harsh Pleistocene winters, the end of the Ice Age was both a promise and a test, as familiar environments vanished beneath rising waters and new ecosystems emerged in their place. In this changing world, humans were no longer merely surviving. They were beginning to shape their destiny. As temperatures rose, the migration of massive animals that had dominated Ice Age ecosystems began to shift. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats, creatures that had once ruled the frozen plains, found their habitats shrinking. Grasslands turned into forests, and food sources for these giants dwindled. Slowly, they began to disappear, victims of both climate change and increasing human skill. For millennia, humans had hunted these enormous animals with crude weapons, but now, as the environment changed, new tools and strategies emerged. Bows, traps, and coordinated hunting techniques that reflected growing intelligence and cooperation. The extinction of megafauna was not just a biological event. It was a cultural turning point, pushing humans to adapt, innovate, and find new sources of sustenance. As the great beasts vanished, human societies turned increasingly to smaller animals, fish, and plant resources. Rivers and lakes teeming with fish became lifelines. Forests provided nuts, berries, and edible roots, while grasslands offered herds of smaller game like deer, elk, and wild goats. People began to settle near stable sources of food and water, slowly breaking away from the purely nomadic lifestyle of their Ice Age ancestors. These semi-permanent camps allowed knowledge to accumulate and traditions to deepen. Skills such as cooking, food storage, and tool-making evolved into arts passed down across generations. The end of the Ice Age thus marked not merely an environmental transition, but the beginning of a profound cultural awakening. But this transformation was far from gentle. As glaciers melted, they unleashed powerful floods that reshaped entire regions. Vast areas of land disappeared beneath newly formed seas. The English Channel was born, cutting Britain off from mainland Europe. Once fertile valleys in what is now the Persian Gulf and the North Sea were drowned, erasing entire landscapes that had supported early human communities. Legends of great floods, preserved in myths from Mesopotamia to the Americas, may have their roots in this chaotic period of rising waters. For early humans, such dramatic changes must have seemed like acts of divine power, a reshaping of the very world by unseen hands. The ground they had hunted upon for generations vanished beneath waves, forcing mass migrations and the formation of new social bonds as groups sought safer, higher ground. As the environment stabilized over the following centuries, the stage was set for one of humanity's greatest transformations, the dawn of agriculture. Warmer temperatures and predictable seasons allowed wild grains to flourish in certain regions, particularly in the Fertile Crescent. Early humans began to experiment with these plants, first by harvesting and later by planting them intentionally. This small step, sowing seeds in the soil, would eventually redefine human existence. But even before the first true farms appeared, the seeds of domestication had already begun in the changing world of the post-Ice Age era. Dogs, long companions in the hunt, became more integrated into human communities, helping to guard camps and assist with hunting smaller prey. Over time, the relationship between humans and animals evolved from one of competition to partnership, shaping the foundations of future civilizations. In a shifting climate of this new age, art and spirituality also evolved. Cave art from the Ice Age had often depicted large animals, symbols of power and survival. But as the world changed, so too did human expression. Rock carvings, figurines, and early symbolic patterns began to reflect a new understanding of life and environment. Fertility, growth, and the cycles of nature became central themes. The earth itself was seen as a living entity, capable of giving and taking life. Rituals and ceremonies likely emerged around the rhythms of the seasons, marking the transitions of planting and harvest, the return of animals, and the phases of the moon. The psychological transformation of humanity mirrored the environmental one, from fear of nature's wrath to reverence for its gifts. The end of the Ice Age also altered the geography of human migration. With ice sheets gone, once blocked routes opened, allowing humans to spread into new continents and islands. North America and Eurasia became more interconnected through shifting land bridges and coastal routes. Seafaring skills began to develop as humans built primitive rafts and boats to explore beyond their familiar horizons. Some groups followed retreating glaciers into high mountain valleys, while others moved toward the newly green plains of Africa, Asia, and Europe. This expansion led to cultural exchange and genetic diversity, creating the complex mosaic of human populations that would later form the world's ancient civilizations. But even amid this global renewal, not all changes were beneficial. The unstable climate still brought droughts, storms, and unpredictable shifts in temperature. Entire communities sometimes vanished when their food sources failed or their lands flooded. It was precisely through these trials that humanity's resilience was forged. Every migration, every adaptation, every innovation became part of the collective memory that guided future generations. The lessons learned at the end of the Ice Age about cooperation, foresight, and the delicate balance with nature would echo through time, influencing the rise of villages, the birth of agriculture, and eventually the creation of cities. In hindsight, the end of the last Ice Age can be seen as humanity's first true rebirth. It marked the closing of one world and the slow emergence of another, a world not of ice and instinct, but of intention and imagination. The melting glaciers did more than reshape the continents. They reshaped the human mind. The struggle to survive in a changing environment awakened creativity, adaptability, and a deeper connection to the land. The Great Cold had tested human endurance, but the thaw tested human vision. In those precious centuries of transformation, humankind began to step out of the shadow of nature and into the light of civilization's first dawn. As rivers carved new paths and forests reclaimed the plains, our ancestors stood at the edge of a new era, gazing across a world reborn. The ice was gone, but its memory lingered, in stories told by the fire, in tools shaped by ancient hands, and in the instincts that still drive us to adapt, explore, and survive. The last Ice Age did not simply end, it transformed. It forged a species that would one day master the earth itself, carrying forward the legacy of fire, art, and endurance born beneath the frozen skies of prehistory. After tens of thousands of years of wandering across ice, tundra, and forest, humanity stood at the threshold of a transformation unlike any before. The world had warmed, the glaciers had receded, and the once frozen plains were now covered with lush vegetation and wild grains. The chaos of the Ice Age had given way to stability, And within this new calm, humankind discovered the power to reshape the earth itself. What began as simple observation, the noticing that fallen seeds sometimes sprouted into new life, would blossom into the single greatest revolution in human history, the birth of agriculture. It was not an event, but a slow awakening, spread across centuries and continents, as scattered communities began to realize that they no longer had to follow food. They could grow it. The first seeds of this revelation were sown in the fertile regions of the Middle East, particularly the area known today as the Fertile Crescent, stretching across modern Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and parts of Turkey and Iran. Here, the soil was rich with nutrients, and the annual flooding of rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates created perfect conditions for wild barley, wheat, and lentils to thrive. Early humans had long gathered these grains, grinding them with stones to make primitive forms of flour. But now, for the first time, they began to scatter seeds intentionally and return later to find them grown. The act was simple, but its consequences were cosmic. The seed, once a gift of nature, had become a tool of human will. Humanity had taken its first conscious step toward controlling its environment rather than merely enduring it. At first, farming was uncertain, unpredictable, and deeply tied to the rhythms of nature. Droughts could ruin harvests, floods could wash away fields. The early farmers had to learn by trial and error, guided by careful observation of weather, soil, and the behavior of plants. Over time, their understanding deepened. They learned when to sow and when to harvest, how to store seeds for the next season, and which grains yielded the best crops. This intimate knowledge of nature gave rise to the first calendars and seasonal rituals. The cycle of planting and reaping became the heartbeat of human life, and with it came a new sense of time, a rhythm not of migration and survival, but of patience, planning, and renewal. Agriculture also transformed the shape of human communities. As people settled near fertile lands, permanent villages began to appear. Mud brick houses replaced temporary shelters, and hearths burned continuously rather than being carried from camp to camp. The first villages were small, perhaps a few dozen families, but they represented something extraordinary: stability. For the first time in human existence, generations could live and die in the same place. Graves were dug near homes, ancestors were remembered, and the concept of home itself took on new meaning. Life was no longer a constant journey. It had found a center. With farming came abundance, and with abundance came complexity. Surplus food meant not everyone had to hunt or gather. Some could focus on other tasks, making tools, crafting pottery, weaving, or building. Specialization emerged, and with it, the roots of trade and social hierarchy. Those who controlled land and grain began to hold power over others. Leadership structures formed, not the temporary leadership of a hunting band, but more permanent systems of governance and ritual. Elders, priests, and chiefs appeared, each claiming authority rooted in either wisdom, divine favor, or control of resources. The seeds of civilization, both literally and socially, were being planted in the soil of these early farming communities. But the dawn of agriculture was not a simple triumph. While it brought food security and population growth, it also introduced new challenges. Living in close quarters led to the spread of disease, something rare among nomadic hunter-gatherers. Diets, once varied with meats, fruits, and wild plants, became dependent on a few staple crops, leading to nutritional deficiencies. Farming also demanded constant labor: plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, a rhythm of toil unknown to the free-roaming lives of the past. The physical burdens of bending under the sun, carrying heavy loads, and tending to fields left their marks on the bones of early farmers. The comfort of settled life came at a price. Even so, humanity's relationship with the land deepened in ways that transcended survival. Early farmers began to view the earth not merely as terrain, but as a living entity. The soil that gave birth to grain, the rain that nourished it, and the sun that ripened it became sacred. Fertility goddesses and agricultural deities emerged in myth, symbols of the life-giving power that flowed through nature. In the Fertile Crescent, figures such as Inanna and Ishtar embodied fertility and renewal. In other regions, similar archetypes appeared, suggesting a shared human recognition of the Earth's creative force. Shrines and small figurines of mother goddesses were buried in fields, offerings meant to ensure the fertility of the soil. Agriculture did not simply change what humans ate, it changed how they saw the universe. Domestication extended beyond plants. Humans began to tame animals that had once been hunted in the wild. Goats and sheep were among the first, followed by cattle and pigs. These animals provided not only meat, but milk, hides, and muscle power for plowing. The bond between human and animal, once based on pursuit and kill, evolved into cooperation. Villages became ecosystems of interdependence, where humans, plants, and animals lived in delicate balance. This new way of life was both revolutionary and fragile, for a failed crop or a sick herd could mean starvation. Yet, through persistence and innovation, early farmers learned to store grain, build granaries, and create clay pots to protect their harvest from pests and decay. The invention of pottery marked another leap forward. With the ability to store and cook food efficiently, communities could survive lean seasons and expand their diet. Pottery became not only functional, but artistic, decorated with intricate patterns that reflected both identity and belief. The designs often mirrored natural motifs, spirals, waves, leaves, symbolizing the cycle of life and growth. In these simple objects, we can glimpse the earliest expressions of human beauty intertwined with necessity. Every pot, every grain stored within it, represented security, a small victory against the uncertainty of the natural world. As agricultural knowledge spread, so did people. The success of early farmers allowed populations to grow, pushing communities into new lands. Techniques were shared and adapted, leading to regional diversity in crops and methods. In China, rice cultivation began along the Yangtze River. In Mesoamerica, maize and beans became the foundation of life. In Africa, sorghum and yams sustained early cultures. Though separated by vast distances, these peoples shared a common revelation that through patience, observation, and cooperation, the earth could be persuaded to yield abundance. This realization linked humanity across continents in a shared destiny. Yet beneath this growing prosperity lay the faint stirrings of division. Ownership of land, once an alien concept to nomadic tribes, became central to farming societies. Boundaries were drawn, disputes arose, and with them came the first conflicts over resources. The world that had once belonged to everyone now began to fracture into territories, clans, and hierarchies. War, in its earliest form, was born not of survival against nature, but of competition among humans. The same fertile soil that gave life also sowed the seeds of rivalry and power. Still, amid these changes, something profound endured: the human spirit of creation. Farming villages evolved into small towns, where collective effort built irrigation channels, walls, and communal granaries. Music, art, and ritual flourished alongside agriculture, as if the act of cultivation extended beyond the soil into the human soul. The rhythm of sowing and reaping echoed in songs and dances, in carvings and stories told by firelight. The field became a metaphor for life itself. What one planted, one would reap. This deep symbolism continues even today, echoing through languages and traditions around the world. By the end of this transformative era, humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. The wandering hunter had become the settled farmer. The world of chance had become a world of choice. Where once survival depended on the whims of nature, it now rested, however precariously, in human hands. Villages clustered around rivers, fields stretched toward the horizon, and the first outlines of civilization began to take form. Humanity had learned to grow food, but in doing so, it had also learned to grow roots, cultural, spiritual, and emotional. The dawn of agriculture was not merely a change in how humans lived. It was a change in what it meant to be human. It bound people to the land, to time, to each other. It created memory and legacy, transforming fleeting existence into enduring culture. The soil that once bore wild grass now bore history itself. The first farmers could not have known it, but in planting those seeds, they were also planting the future of cities, kingdoms, and the endless pursuit of knowledge that would define the human story for millennia to come. As the first farmers began to sow and harvest, a subtle yet profound transformation unfolded across the post-Ice Age world. Where previously humans had wandered from one hunting ground to the next, they now began to build dwellings meant to last. Small clusters of homes emerged along riverbanks, in fertile valleys, and near abundant forests. These early settlements were humble at first, mud brick huts with thatched roofs, circular or rectangular, sometimes clustered around a communal fire. But they were revolutionary, a place where generations could live and die without moving, where memory and tradition could accumulate, and where humans could begin to experiment with cooperation on a scale previously impossible. The rise of villages marked the first step toward social complexity. In these settlements, work could be divided. Some people tended crops, while others hunted nearby forests or fished in streams. Some crafted tools, wove baskets, or shaped pottery. The emergence of specialization allowed for the accumulation of skill and knowledge, transforming survival from a daily struggle into a deliberate endeavor. Villagers could experiment with new crops, develop irrigation systems, and store surplus food for leaner seasons. With storage came security, and with security came the freedom to create, innovate, and imagine beyond the immediate necessities of life. Villages were more than practical. They were social crucibles. In small communities, human relationships became more intricate and layered. Elders assumed advisory roles, shaping decisions about planting, defense, and ritual. Families were linked not only by blood, but by shared labor, shared meals, and shared responsibility for the survival of the group. Conflict, once resolved primarily through flight or individual combat, now required negotiation, mediation, and sometimes hierarchy. Leadership was not yet codified into kings or chiefs, but the earliest forms of governance were emerging, laying the groundwork for future civilizations. The layout of these early settlements often reflected a deep connection with the land and the natural world. Villages clustered near rivers not only for water and food, but also for symbolic reasons. The river represented life, renewal, and continuity. Fields were carefully positioned for sunlight and drainage, while communal areas for gatherings or rituals reflected a sense of shared purpose. Sacred spaces, often marked by stones, figurines, or simple altars, allowed villagers to connect with forces larger than themselves, blending survival with spirituality. Religion, art, and daily life were interwoven, creating the first cultural tapestries of human society. With permanence came the seeds of inequality. Some families controlled larger plots of land, better access to water, or surplus grain. Social distinctions began to emerge, and with them, prestige and influence. Those who could manage food and labor effectively became natural leaders. The first social hierarchies were subtle but significant. Elders, skilled craftsmen, and religious figures held sway, while others deferred for the sake of cohesion and survival. Early settlements were both egalitarian and stratified, a delicate balance between cooperation and competition that would define human communities for millennia. Trade emerged naturally from this process. Villages exchanged surplus crops, crafted tools, and decorative items with neighboring communities. Stone axes, beads, shells, and pottery traveled vast distances, linking distant groups through networks of commerce and cultural exchange. This interaction fostered the spread of ideas as well as goods. Techniques in farming, toolmaking, and art were shared across regions, allowing innovations to spread far faster than in purely nomadic societies. In this way, even small villages became nodes of a growing, interconnected human world. Agriculture and settlement also transformed the perception of time. In hunter-gatherer societies, days were measured by the rising and setting of the sun and the movement of game. In villages, time became cyclical, marked by planting, growth, harvest, and storage. Calendars, often tied to lunar cycles, began to guide agricultural activity. These cycles informed religious observances and festivals, embedding the rhythms of the earth into the social and spiritual lives of the people. The measurement of time became both practical and symbolic, creating continuity between past, present, and future generations. The physical evidence of these settlements reveals a great deal about daily life. Archaeologists have found hearths for cooking, granaries for storage, and rudimentary drainage systems that prevented fields from flooding. Pottery decorated with geometric patterns suggests that aesthetic expression had entered daily life. Figurines of animals and humans hint at early religious or ritual practices. Even in these humble beginnings, humans were creating not merely a home, but a culture, a set of shared meanings, beliefs, and practices that distinguish them from mere survivalists. Defense became an increasing concern as settlements grew. As resources became more concentrated, raids and territorial disputes became more likely. Villages began to fortify themselves with ditches, palisades, or natural barriers. Guarding food and livestock became a communal responsibility. The need to protect life and sustenance encouraged further cooperation and strategy, laying the foundations for organized militias and early forms of warfare. The struggle to survive was no longer solely against nature. It now included other humans, a pattern that would intensify as societies grew larger and more complex. Cultural identity flourished alongside practical innovation. Oral traditions, stories, songs, and myths began to codify history, moral lessons, and local knowledge. Rituals tied to planting, harvest, and seasonal changes reinforced community bonds. Celebrations and ceremonies were no longer just for survival. They were a way to define the collective identity of the village, to pass knowledge to the young, and to anchor society in shared belief. These traditions created continuity, allowing lessons learned over generations to endure and evolve. The rise of villages set the stage for the first cities. As populations grew, settlements expanded, developing markets, communal granaries, and religious centers. Villages became towns, towns became city-states, and cities eventually coalesced into empires. Yet the roots of these magnificent societies were deeply human. Cooperation, observation, creativity, and the ability to adapt to a changing world. The lessons learned in the first villages, the value of surplus, social cohesion, ritual, and innovation, resonated through history, influencing every subsequent civilization. Even as these villages took shape, they reflected humanity's growing awareness of both fragility and possibility. The post-Ice Age world had tested resilience and rewarded ingenuity. Humans had learned to harness the land, to plan for the future, and to work collectively toward goals larger than themselves. These early settlements were laboratories of civilization, incubators of art, technology, and social structure. The decisions made by these first farmers, where to build, what to grow, how to organize, would echo across centuries, shaping the destiny of entire regions. By the end of this era, humanity had taken a decisive step. The wandering life of hunter-gatherers had given way to the rooted life of farmers and villagers. The land was no longer a mere backdrop. It had become a partner, a teacher, and a challenge. Life in villages was precarious yet promising, laborious yet transformative. Each home, each field, each hearth symbolized the first conscious attempt to control the environment, to create stability, and to lay down roots for the future. In these humble beginnings, the story of civilization itself was being written. As villages thrived and populations grew, a new phenomenon began to reshape human existence: the rise of cities. Unlike scattered rural settlements, these early urban centers were hubs of innovation, commerce, and culture, where thousands of people lived in close quarters and shared a common destiny. The first cities did not emerge overnight. They were the product of centuries of agricultural development, social organization, and technological progress. Surplus crops made it possible to feed larger populations, while trade and specialization created opportunities for craftsmen, merchants, and religious leaders to occupy essential roles beyond mere survival. These cities represented humanity's first concentrated experiment in complex society. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, is often cited as the cradle of urban civilization. Here, fertile soil and predictable flooding supported large-scale agriculture, creating the foundation for city life. Sumerian settlements like Uruk, Uar, and Eridu became bustling centers of human activity. Streets were lined with mud brick homes. Markets thrived with the exchange of grain, pottery, and tools, and temples rose as imposing symbols of religious authority. The ziggurat, a step pyramid of mud and brick, dominated the skyline, symbolizing the link between the people, their rulers, and the divine. These cities were not just practical. They were deeply spiritual and cultural, reflecting the values and beliefs of their inhabitants. One of the defining features of these early cities was social stratification. Unlike villages, where status was often based on age, experience, or skill, cities developed more rigid hierarchies. Kings and priests wielded authority, while merchants, artisans, and laborers each occupied defined social roles. This hierarchy was reinforced through laws, religious rituals, and monumental architecture. The famous Code of Uarnamu, one of the earliest known legal systems, illustrates the emergence of structured governance in these urban centers. Citizens were no longer equal in the way hunter-gatherers might have been. Society was now organized around roles, responsibilities, and privileges. Trade and specialization flourished in these cities. Artisans produced pottery, textiles, and metal tools, while scribes developed writing systems to track transactions, maintain records, and codify laws. The invention of cuneiform in Mesopotamia marked a turning point. Humans could now record history, communicate across distances, and transmit knowledge beyond memory. Accounting and record-keeping allowed cities to manage resources efficiently, plan large projects, and sustain growing populations. Markets became vibrant centers of exchange, bringing together people from diverse backgrounds and laying the groundwork for cultural cross-pollination that would define civilization. Religion and ritual were central to urban life. Temples were not only places of worship, but also centers of administration, education, and trade. Priests interpreted the will of the gods, predicted floods, advised rulers, and mediated disputes. Festivals and ceremonies punctuated the agricultural and civic calendar, reinforcing social cohesion and shared identity. Gods were believed to influence every aspect of life, from the success of crops to the outcome of battles. Urban populations, living in close proximity, relied on these rituals to provide a sense of order and security amidst the complexity and unpredictability of city life. The rise of cities also transformed technology and innovation. Irrigation systems expanded beyond the needs of a single village, allowing water to reach distant fields and sustain larger populations. Pottery kilns, metalworking furnaces, and stone carving techniques advanced rapidly. Urban centers became laboratories of experimentation, where ideas could be tested, refined, and shared. This technological progress was inseparable from social organization. Without coordinated labor, planning, and administration, large-scale projects like canals, city walls, or monumental temples would have been impossible. Defense became a crucial concern. Cities attracted wealth, resources, and people, but they also attracted threats. Walls, gates, and watchtowers were constructed to protect inhabitants from raiding neighbors and nomadic groups. Military organization became more sophisticated, withstanding forces and coordinated strategies. The need for protection further reinforced hierarchical structures, placing power in the hands of leaders who could defend the city. Urban life offered security, but it also demanded vigilance and cooperation to survive. Despite these advances, life in the first cities was precarious. Disease spread rapidly in crowded conditions. Fires could destroy entire neighborhoods built of flammable mud bricks and thatch. Food shortages, climate fluctuations, or political instability could threaten the survival of the city. Living in an urban environment required careful planning, coordination, and foresight. Yet the potential rewards, cultural richness, economic opportunity, spiritual fulfillment, and the chance to leave a lasting mark outweighed the risks for those willing to embrace city life. Urbanization also altered human psychology. Living in close quarters fostered complex social behaviors, negotiation, leadership, collaboration, and conflict resolution. Laws and traditions codified behavior, teaching generations to navigate intricate social networks. Cities became centers of identity, where people derived status, purpose, and meaning from their roles within the urban fabric. Architecture, art, and writing reflected human aspirations, capturing both the practical and the sublime aspects of city life. Urban dwellers were no longer simply surviving. They were striving, imagining, and building futures beyond the immediacy of survival. As cities grew, they began to influence surrounding regions. Villagers and smaller settlements depended on urban centers for trade, protection, and cultural guidance. Roads, canals, and communication networks spread outward, linking distant communities. Cities became hubs in a web of interdependence, shaping economies, social structures, and political alliances across landscapes. The rise of the first cities marked a decisive shift from local, self-contained communities to interconnected societies capable of sustaining large populations and complex institutions. Education and record-keeping became cornerstones of city life. Scribes trained in specialized schools preserved not only economic and administrative records, but also literature, scientific observations, and religious texts. Knowledge could now be passed down through generations with unprecedented accuracy, creating continuity and a shared sense of history. This intellectual development laid the foundation for philosophy, law, and science, establishing cities as the incubators of human thought and civilization. The first cities also sparked early experimentation in governance and law. Kings, councils, and priestly authorities emerged as mechanisms to manage the growing complexity of urban life. Systems of justice, taxation, and civic responsibility were established, reflecting the need for order in environments where thousands of people coexisted. These governance structures evolved over centuries, but their roots were in the first urban settlements, where cooperation and authority became essential to survival and prosperity. Cultural expression flourished in city life. Music, dance, storytelling, and art were no longer purely ceremonial. They became part of daily existence. Public spaces hosted performances, marketplaces buzzed with debate, and artisans displayed intricate work. Urban environments enabled collaboration and competition in creative endeavors, accelerating innovation and cultural development. Civilization, in its earliest form, was as much a product of imagination and expression as it was of agriculture and trade. By the end of this period, humanity had crossed another threshold. The city represented both triumph and challenge. The concentration of people, resources, and knowledge brought unprecedented opportunity, but also demanded unprecedented responsibility. Urban life demanded foresight, cooperation, and organization. It offered culture, learning, and permanence. It created inequalities, conflicts, and vulnerabilities. In cities, the human story became self-conscious, deliberate, and ambitious. These early urban centers laid the foundations for the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and beyond, civilizations that would define the trajectory of history for millennia. The first cities were more than settlements. They were experiments in collective human potential. They tested the limits of cooperation, innovation, and governance. They became repositories of memory, culture, and aspiration. And in their streets, temples, and markets, humanity discovered a new truth. By working together, by recording knowledge, and by shaping the environment, it could transcend the mere struggle to survive and begin the long journey towards civilization itself. The rise of cities brought a transformation unlike any before, the birth of writing. Where once human knowledge had been ephemeral, carried only in memory, songs, and stories, writing allowed experience to transcend generations. It began as a practical tool born from necessity. City life demanded record-keeping. Grain distributions, trade transactions, labor obligations, and taxation needed precision. Symbols carved into clay tablets or inscribed on stone preserve information that words spoken aloud could never secure. This innovation marked humanity's first leap into history itself, a conscious effort to document, organize, and interpret the human experience. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians developed cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. Initially, each symbol represented a commodity or number, a straightforward record of exchange. But over centuries, cuneiform evolved to capture abstract ideas, legal codes, religious hymns, myths, and historical chronicles. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest known works of literature, emerged from this system, telling of heroes, mortality, and the quest for meaning. Writing allowed humans to externalize thought, to wrestle with existence on the page, and to build a collective memory that could outlast individual lifetimes. Writing was revolutionary not just for its permanence, but for its universality. In the villages and cities of Mesopotamia, literacy initially belonged to a specialized class. Scribes trained for years to master the complex symbols. These scribes were the keepers of knowledge, the mediators between memory and permanence. They recorded laws, contracts, religious rituals, and astronomical observations. By documenting events, they shaped collective understanding. Who held power, how societies functioned, and what mattered to people across generations. In a sense, writing created history itself, transforming memory into narrative and narrative into legacy. Beyond practical applications, writing enabled reflection and interpretation. The first chronicles were not simply lists of kings or battles. They often included commentary, moral lessons, and prophecy. Scribes noted patterns in the rise and fall of rulers, in floods, famines, and conquests. They began to ask questions that humans had never asked before. Why do societies succeed or fail? What forces shape destiny? These early historians, whether priestly scribes or royal clerks, recognized that events were connected, and by recording them, humans might gain insight into the natural and divine forces that govern life. Writing was a tool for prediction as well as preservation. The invention of writing also enabled law and governance to become formalized. Legal codes like the Code of Yuarnamu and later the Code of Hammurabi were carved in stone, visible to all and enforceable across cities and territories. Laws transformed society by establishing expectations, rights, and consequences. Writing allowed rulers to project authority across time and space, binding communities together with shared rules and principles. It also created accountability. Actions could be documented, agreements could be enforced, and justice could be systematically pursued. The codification of law was humanity's first conscious attempt to govern itself through knowledge rather than only through force or tradition. Religion and writing became intertwined. Priests recorded rituals, prayers, and hymns, ensuring uniformity and continuity across generations. Sacred texts, inscribed in clay or on scrolls, codify beliefs, myths, and moral frameworks. In doing so, writing allowed religion to transcend locality, connecting communities separated by geography but united by shared faith. From these early texts emerged notions of morality, justice, and destiny that influenced not only daily life but also the organization of society itself. Written word became a bridge between the mortal and the divine, giving permanence to spiritual insights that might otherwise have been lost. Writing also expanded the human imagination. Stories of gods, heroes, and distant lands were no longer confined to oral transmission. Epic poems, genealogies, and allegories could circulate, inspiring wonder and reflection. Education became a conscious effort, with young scribes trained to read and write, and to think critically about the texts they copied. Knowledge could now be cumulative. One generation could build upon the discoveries of the previous, creating a chain of intellectual inheritance that would extend into science, philosophy, and literature. The written word was a seed from which civilization's intellectual branches would grow. The spread of writing transformed trade and economics as well. Merchants and traders could now record transactions, track inventories, and negotiate agreements with clarity and permanence. Contracts reduced disputes, standardized measures and currencies facilitated exchange, and marketplaces became hubs of both goods and ideas. Writing allowed urban centers to coordinate complex projects such as irrigation, construction, and defense with a precision previously impossible. Cities could function as cohesive systems, supported by the documentation that connected leaders, workers, and citizens across space and time. However, the rise of writing also created new divisions. Literacy was initially rare, a privilege of those trained within elite institutions. The ability to read and write conferred power, allowing scribes and rulers to control knowledge, record history from their perspective, and shape collective memory. Oral traditions persisted alongside written texts, but the balance of authority was shifting. Those who controlled the written word controlled understanding, and thus influence over their societies. Writing was a democratizing tool in potential, but in practice, it reinforced social hierarchies. The first historians also grappled with the nature of truth. Writing allowed humans to preserve memory, but also allowed interpretation, bias, and myth-making. Chronicles combined fact and legend, blending observation with imagination. The line between reality and narrative was fluid, and in this ambiguity lay both danger and power. Societies learned that knowledge could inspire, guide, or manipulate. Writing was not neutral. It was a tool that shaped perception, identity, and the understanding of human destiny. As civilizations expanded, writing became a unifying force. It enabled communication across vast distances and generations, preserving trade networks, legal systems, religious rituals, and cultural traditions. Letters, decrees, and treaties could travel farther and endure longer than any messenger. Knowledge became portable and permanent, allowing humans to transcend the limitations of individual memory. In essence, writing created continuity, anchoring societies in a shared narrative that could survive upheaval, conquest, and the passage of time. By the end of this period, the written word had irrevocably altered human society. Cities were no longer just centers of population and trade. They were centers of knowledge, law, and culture. Humanity could now remember, interpret, and plan. Writing provided the scaffolding for history itself, transforming fleeting human experience into enduring record. Through writing, humans gained the ability to understand patterns, learn from the past, and envision the future. The emergence of writing marked the point where civilization moved from memory to consciousness, from survival to reflection, from instinct to intentionality. In the hands of scribes, the world became legible. History, prophecy, law, and culture were preserved for generations to come. Writing allowed humanity to speak across time, to challenge, instruct, and inspire. And in the clay tablets, stone inscriptions, and early scrolls of the first cities, we see the birth of a new human enterprise, the conscious recording of civilization, a dialogue with the past, and a gift to the future. As cities expanded and writing flourished, a new and delicate balance of power emerged. Human societies, now densely populated and economically complex, required organization and leadership beyond the informal councils of elders that governed villages. This period witnessed the rise of kings and priests as central figures of authority, their roles intertwined yet distinct, shaping not only daily life, but the very worldview of the people. Kings claimed dominion over land and resources, while priests interpreted the will of the gods, mediating between the divine and mortal realms. Together, they created the first structured hierarchies, consolidating power in ways that would define civilization for millennia. The earliest kings were often warrior leaders or tribal chiefs who rose to prominence through prowess in battle or skill and negotiation. Yet as cities grew, the responsibilities of leadership became more multifaceted. Kings were expected to manage agriculture, oversee trade, enforce laws, and protect the population from both external threats and internal discord. Authority became legitimized not only through personal strength but also through divine sanction. Many rulers claimed to act on behalf of the gods, portraying themselves as chosen or appointed to maintain order and prosperity. This intertwining of political and religious legitimacy strengthened their grip on power, creating a fusion of governance and belief that would endure across cultures. Priests held an equally influential role, often serving as the intellectual and spiritual backbone of early cities. They interpreted omens, maintained records, conducted rituals, and advised rulers. By controlling knowledge of the divine, priests could influence decisions, mediate disputes, and reinforce social norms. Temples became centers of administration as well as worship, housing granaries, workshops, and libraries. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurat functioned as a hub for both spiritual and civic life, illustrating the inseparability of religion and governance. Priestly authority shaped public perception, emphasizing that obedience to rulers and adherence to ritual were intertwined with the favor of the gods. The relationship between kings and priests was both cooperative and competitive. While both benefited from stable and prosperous society, their interests occasionally diverged. Kings sought to expand territory, consolidate resources, and project power, whereas priests prioritized religious observance, ritual propriety, and the interpretation of divine will. In some instances, priests wielded enough influence to challenge rulers, guiding decisions, or even restricting authority. In others, kings subordinated religious figures to reinforce their political dominance. The dynamic tension between spiritual and temporal power became a defining feature of early civilization, influencing laws, warfare, and cultural development. Hierarchy and social stratification extended beyond rulers and priests. Merchants, artisans, laborers, and farmers each occupied distinct roles within the urban ecosystem. Control of resources and knowledge often determined status, reinforcing the power of the elite while obliging lower classes to perform essential labor. Laws codified responsibilities and privileges, creating a social contract that maintained order. In Mesopotamia, for example, the Code of Hammurabi delineated rights, punishments, and obligations across social strata, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of governance and justice. Authority, once fluid in small communities, became formalized, with rulers and priests embodying the centralized power necessary for large urban populations to function cohesively. Military power reinforced authority. Kings maintained standing armies to protect cities, secure trade routes, and expand territories. Fortifications, walls, and watchtowers became symbols of strength and deterrence. Military success not only secured resources but also reinforced the ruler's legitimacy, demonstrating the ability to maintain order and provide security. Conquered peoples were often incorporated into the city-state's economic and social system, sometimes through tribute, labor, or alliance, further consolidating the ruler's power. Authority was both protective and coercive, balancing the promise of prosperity with the threat of violence. Religious and political authority shaped cultural life as well. Monumental architecture, temple complexes, and ceremonial spaces reinforced social hierarchies and projected power. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals were public demonstrations of control, integrating citizens into a shared worldview. Myths and stories often glorified kings, portraying them as heroic figures chosen by the gods, linking temporal rule to cosmic order. In this way, authority was both tangible, through enforcement of laws and military might, and symbolic, creating a narrative in which the social order reflected divine intention. Education and literacy became tools of authority. Knowledge of writing and ritual practices was concentrated among scribes, priests, and elite administrators. This created a class capable of preserving and transmitting knowledge, reinforcing social hierarchies. Record-keeping allowed rulers to monitor populations, manage resources, and plan infrastructure. Written decrees extended the reach of authority beyond immediate observation, embedding the ruler's power in law and text. Literacy was both empowerment and control, allowing some to shape society while others remained bound by the structures created. The influence of kings and priests extended to law, morality, and justice. Legal codes, often linked to divine authority, established societal norms and expectations. Temples acted as courts, resolving disputes and ensuring compliance with both religious and civic rules. Authority was exercised not only through physical force, but through ritualized order, creating a society in which obedience and belief were mutually reinforcing. The population internalized the principles of hierarchy, understanding their place within a divinely sanctioned order. Despite their power, rulers and priests were accountable to broader forces. Natural disasters, famine, or military defeat could undermine legitimacy. Cities that prospered under wise governance could collapse under poor leadership or environmental stress. Authority, therefore, required constant negotiation between human ambition, divine will, and the unpredictable forces of nature. Kings and priests were both empowered and constrained, illustrating the delicate balance of power that defined early civilization. The concentration of authority also fostered innovation and progress. Coordinated leadership allowed the construction of canals, temples, and public works. Centralized decision-making facilitated trade, law enforcement, and defense. Urban centers became laboratories for experimentation in governance, economics, and culture. Rulers and priests, by consolidating knowledge and resources, created conditions under which cities could flourish, ideas could circulate, and civilization could advance. By the end of this era, the structure of authority had become fundamental to human society. Kings and priests embodied the principles of organization, control, and vision necessary for the survival and prosperity of dense populations. They were both creators and regulators, shaping human behavior, belief, and destiny. Through their leadership, humanity learned to balance cooperation and hierarchy, ambition and restraint, ritual and pragmatism. Authority became a defining feature of civilization, guiding humans from scattered settlements to complex societies capable of building enduring legacies. The rise of kings and priests revealed a profound truth. Human societies could achieve extraordinary coordination and creativity, but only when guided by structured authority. Power was both protective and instructive, linking individuals to larger purposes and providing the framework for culture, innovation, and survival. In these early cities, humanity discovered that leadership, when wielded wisely, could transform not only the lives of individuals, but the course of history itself. With the rise of cities and centralized authority came a new force that would reshape human history: trade. What began as simple exchange of surplus grain or crafted goods evolved into complex networks spanning regions, linking distant communities and fostering wealth, influence, and cultural exchange. Trade became more than a means of survival. It was a driver of innovation, social stratification, and the eventual emergence of empires. As humans connected across landscapes, they discovered that wealth was not merely a personal asset, but a tool for power, expansion, and legacy. Early trade networks were often regional, connecting villages to cities and cities to other urban centers. Surplus crops, pottery, textiles, and tools were exchanged for stone, metals, timber, and other scarce resources. Rivers and seas became highways of commerce, while caravans traversed deserts and mountain passes. The movement of goods facilitated the spread of ideas, technology, and cultural practices. Techniques in agriculture, metallurgy, and pottery could be transmitted far from their origin, accelerating human development. Trade made the world smaller, linking communities previously isolated by geography, climate, or culture. Markets became vibrant centers of economic, social, and political life. In Mesopotamian cities like Ur and Babylon, bazaars bustled with activity. Merchants negotiated prices, scribes recorded transactions, and craftsmen displayed their wares. Markets were more than transactional spaces. They were arenas of communication, creativity, and influence. The exchange of goods carried with it the exchange of ideas, customs, and knowledge. Through trade, humans began to understand that wealth could extend beyond individual survival. It could shape societies, dictate alliances, and elevate certain groups above others. The accumulation of wealth transformed social hierarchies. Those who controlled trade routes, storage facilities, or precious commodities gained influence over cities and their surrounding regions. Merchants and financiers could rival or complement the power of kings and priests, forming an emergent elite whose authority rested on economic control rather than strictly political or religious command. Wealth created both opportunity and tension, fostering competition, alliances, and, inevitably, conflict. The distribution of resources became central to maintaining stability, while scarcity could provoke upheaval. Economic power became inseparable from social and political power. Trade also drove technological innovation. The need to transport goods efficiently encouraged the development of wheeled vehicles, riverboats, and roads. Standardized weights, measures, and currencies emerged to facilitate exchange and reduce disputes. Accounting practices became increasingly sophisticated, with ledgers, seals, and inscriptions documenting the flow of resources. Cities invested in infrastructure, ports, canals, and marketplaces to support commerce and maximize profits. Economic activity demanded organization, foresight, and cooperation, reinforcing the social and political frameworks already established by kings and priests. The desire for exotic goods expanded the geographic scope of trade. Metals like copper, tin, and later iron were essential for tools and weapons, prompting long-distance exchanges. Precious stones, dyes, and textiles traveled from distant lands, introducing new aesthetic and cultural influences. Ideas, religious practices, and technological innovations moved along these routes as well, intertwining material and intellectual progress. Trade networks became conduits for both wealth and knowledge, laying the foundation for increasingly interconnected civilizations. The concentration of wealth in certain cities and among certain elites sowed the seeds of empire. Control over resources, trade routes, and fertile lands allowed rulers to extend influence beyond the immediate urban center. Alliances and conquests followed, as cities sought to dominate surrounding regions. Military campaigns were often motivated as much by the desire to secure economic resources as by political ambition or religious ideology. Empires began not as sprawling territories, but as networks of cities and trade routes bound by the strategic use of wealth and power. Trade also transformed cultural and social life. Cities became melting pots, hosting travelers, merchants, and artisans from distant lands. Ideas about religion, art, science, and governance spread along commercial networks, creating hybrid cultures and shared knowledge. Urban centers became cosmopolitan spaces where different traditions met and influenced one another. Cultural exchange enriched societies, fostering innovation and diversity while also creating new tensions as different groups competed for influence and resources. The regulation of trade became a crucial aspect of governance. Kings and priests monitored markets, levied taxes, and established laws governing transactions. Written contracts and standardized measurements ensured fairness and reduced disputes, while official oversight reinforced the authority of the ruling class. Wealth and commerce were inseparable from governance. A city could not thrive without trade, and trade could not thrive without stability. The symbiotic relationship between economic activity and political control strengthened the foundations of early states and prepared them for expansion. The pursuit of wealth also introduced moral and ethical considerations. The concentration of resources sparked debates about fairness, social responsibility, and the proper use of power. Religious teachings and legal codes addressed these concerns, linking prosperity to justice, piety, and duty. Rituals and offerings reinforced the connection between divine favor and economic success, embedding commerce within a broader spiritual and cultural framework. Wealth was not only material, it was symbolic, reflecting virtue, divine blessing, and social standing. By the end of this era, trade had fundamentally reshaped human societies. It created wealth, specialization, and interdependence. It encouraged exploration, innovation, and the spread of knowledge. It concentrated power, fostered social hierarchies, and set the stage for the emergence of empires. Cities were no longer isolated entities. They were nodes in vast networks of exchange, connected by commerce, culture, and ambition. The pursuit of wealth became a driving force in human history, motivating expansion, fostering creativity, and shaping the destiny of civilizations. Trade was more than the movement of goods. It was the movement of ideas, power, and opportunity. Through trade, humans discovered the potential to reshape the world, to extend influence across landscapes, and to create enduring legacies. The seeds of empire were sown not only in conquest, but in commerce. Wealth became both a tool and a symbol, linking economic success to political authority, cultural influence, and spiritual significance. In this dynamic interplay of exchange, ambition, and innovation, humanity learned that prosperity could transform not only individuals, but entire societies. As cities prospered and trade networks expanded, conflict became an unavoidable part of human life. Wealth, resources, and territory created both opportunity and tension, and the rise of centralized authority made organized warfare possible on an unprecedented scale. Where once small groups clashed over hunting grounds or water sources, entire city-states and regions now mobilized armies, fortified borders, and pursued strategies that could determine the fate of millions. War became both a tool and a test, a method to acquire resources, assert dominance, and defend societal structures, while simultaneously exposing the fragility of human civilization. Early warfare was closely tied to geography and economics. Fertile lands, strategic trade routes, and vital water sources were coveted by neighboring city-states. Control of these resources ensured prosperity security, and political influence. Battles were fought with organized units wielding spears, bows, and early forms of chariots, demanding coordination, discipline, and leadership. Victory brought not only material gain, but also prestige, reinforcing the legitimacy of kings and ruling elites. Defeat, conversely, could result in the destruction of cities, the displacement of populations, and the collapse of established authority. The stakes of conflict had grown far beyond individual survival, encompassing entire societies. The social impact of war was profound. Military service became both a duty and a path to status. Soldiers were trained, equipped, and organized into units with defined roles, creating the first professional armies. Societies mobilized resources to support campaigns, from food supplies to weapon production, linking civilian labor directly to the machinery of war. This integration of society into military effort fostered cohesion, but also heightened vulnerability. If resources failed or morale broke, the entire city-state could be imperiled. War became a mirror of civilization itself, reflecting its strengths, weaknesses, and ambitions. Leadership and strategy played a decisive role in the outcomes of conflicts. Kings and generals employed intelligence, diplomacy, and psychological tactics to outmaneuver opponents. Siege warfare tested engineering skills, with attackers constructing ramps, towers, and battering devices while defenders reinforced walls, moats, and gates. The rise of professional soldiers, combined with technological innovation, transformed warfare into a sophisticated enterprise requiring foresight, planning, and coordination. Military success was inseparable from political authority. A ruler who could command armies effectively secured both power and legacy. Religion and ideology were closely intertwined with war. Kings claimed divine sanction for campaigns, portraying victories as evidence of favor from the gods. Priests interpreted omens and performed rituals to ensure success, reinforcing the connection between spiritual authority and military power. Wars were framed not merely as political contests, but as cosmic struggles, with moral and spiritual dimensions that demanded participation and obedience. This blending of the sacred and the strategic elevated conflict from a practical necessity to a cultural and existential narrative. Trade and conquest were often linked. Cities that dominated strategic routes or resource-rich regions gained wealth, influence, and leverage over neighbors. Empires expanded not only through diplomacy, but also through military force, integrating conquered territories into their economic and administrative systems. Tribute, taxation, and labor systems reinforced the authority of rulers while facilitating the spread of culture, technology, and ideas. Warfare was both destructive and constructive, reshaping political boundaries, economic networks, and social hierarchies. The consequences of war were deeply human. Populations endured displacement, famine, and disease, while cities could be reduced to rubble. Yet war also stimulated innovation. Defensive architecture, metallurgy, and organizational systems evolve in response to military needs. The experience of conflict reinforced the importance of leadership, planning, and cohesion, shaping social norms and cultural values. Generations learned from both victories and defeats, internalizing lessons about resilience, loyalty, and ambition. War became a teacher as well as a destroyer. Urbanization magnified the stakes of conflict. Crowded cities concentrated wealth, knowledge, and population, making them attractive targets and strategic prizes. The need to protect urban centers drove investment in walls, fortifications, and military logistics. At the same time, cities provided the administrative and economic infrastructure necessary to sustain prolonged campaigns. The interplay between offense and defense shaped urban planning, architecture, and governance, revealing the inseparability of war and civilization in this era. Diplomacy emerged alongside warfare as a means to negotiate alliances, manage rivalries, and secure peace. Marriages, treaties, and tribute agreements were tools to stabilize regions without resorting to continuous conflict. Skilled diplomacy could prevent destruction and facilitate trade, while failure often led to escalation. Leaders learned to balance coercion with negotiation, understanding that long-term stability required both strength and tact. Politics, war, and commerce became intricately linked, forming a triad that would define human civilization for centuries. The cultural impact of warfare was significant. Epic tales, songs, and myths celebrated victories and commemorated sacrifices, embedding lessons of bravery, strategy, and loyalty into collective memory. Monuments, inscriptions, and artifacts preserved the legacy of battles, creating narratives that reinforced social cohesion and collective identity. Through war, societies codified values, glorified heroes, and passed moral and strategic lessons to future generations. Conflict, though destructive, became a lens through which civilizations understood themselves and their place in the world. By the end of this era, war had become a defining feature of human development. It shaped borders, hierarchies, and governance structures, while influencing trade, culture, and religion. Conquest and defense were inseparable from the growth of cities and empires, demonstrating the delicate balance between human ambition and vulnerability. Societies learned that survival required not only agricultural skill, trade networks, and governance, but also the ability to wield and withstand force. War became both a crucible and a catalyst for civilization, forging societies in the fires of conflict while testing their resilience, strategy, and vision. Through conflict, humans discovered the duality of power. It could protect or destroy, elevate or enslave. Kings, priests, and citizens alike understood that the destiny of cities and of civilizations depended on the ability to navigate the turbulent currents of ambition, rivalry, and survival. In this crucible, humanity honed the skills of organization, strategy, and resilience that would echo through the ages, shaping the political, social, and cultural foundations of the world to come. As cities flourished, trade expanded, and empires rose and fell, another transformation quietly reshaped human civilization: the pursuit of knowledge. Beyond survival, beyond wealth and power, humans began to ask questions about the world itself. Why do rivers flood? Why do seasons change? What governs the movement of stars? The complexity of urban life, the organization of labor, and the pressures of governance created a fertile ground for observation, experimentation, and reflection. Knowledge became both a practical necessity and a spiritual quest, intertwining daily life with curiosity about the natural and supernatural realms. The early centers of learning were often temples and administrative hubs, where scribes, priests, and scholars recorded observations of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and agriculture. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets preserved meticulous records of celestial movements, predicting lunar cycles, eclipses, and the changing seasons. These observations were initially tied to religion and governance, ensuring the timing of rituals, festivals, and agricultural activities. Yet, within these practical concerns lay the seeds of systematic inquiry. Humans began to recognize patterns, develop models, and seek explanations for natural phenomena. Knowledge became a bridge between the human and the cosmic. Mathematics emerged as a tool for both practicality and abstraction, Accounting, trade, and construction demanded precise calculation, leading to the development of arithmetic, geometry, and measurement systems. Architects and engineers used these tools to construct temples, canals, and city walls with remarkable accuracy. Surveying techniques allowed for land division and irrigation planning, directly supporting urban growth and agricultural efficiency. The application of mathematical principles was not merely technical. It reflected a growing human desire to understand the underlying order of the world. Medicine and health also advanced in this era, driven by both necessity and observation. Urban density created new challenges. Disease could spread rapidly, sanitation was essential, and injuries from labor or conflict required treatment. Physicians, often trained in temple schools, documented remedies, surgical techniques, and herbal medicines. Medical texts combined empirical observation with spiritual belief, reflecting an understanding that health involved both physical and metaphysical factors. In doing so, humans began to systematize knowledge about the body, illness, and healing, a foundation for later scientific inquiry. Astronomy and cosmology were closely linked to religion, yet they laid the groundwork for critical observation and prediction. Priests and scholars charted the stars, planets, and celestial events to interpret divine messages and ensure proper timing of festivals. Over time, patterns were discerned. The movements of celestial bodies could be predicted, calendars could be standardized, and seasonal changes could be anticipated. Observation became experimentation, and rituals became structured around knowledge rather than intuition alone. Humanity was learning to read the universe, to detect order within apparent chaos. Technology advanced in tandem with knowledge. Metallurgy, irrigation, construction, and transportation improved as observation, measurement, and experimentation informed practice. Innovations were not isolated. Knowledge spread along trade routes, shared between cities and cultures. Techniques in bronze and iron working, pottery, textile production, and writing proliferated, enhancing economic, military, and cultural capacities. Science, technology, and civilization evolved together, each enabling the other to reach greater heights. Education became institutionalized in urban centers. Scribes trained apprentices, priests instructed novices, and scholars debated theories. Knowledge was transmitted deliberately, not solely through oral tradition. This allowed for cumulative progress. New generations could build upon previous discoveries, refine methods, and expand understanding. The written word, already vital for record-keeping, became central to the pursuit of truth, preserving observations, theories, and calculations for posterity. Civilization could now consciously shape its intellectual trajectory. Curiosity also inspired philosophy and reflection. Scholars pondered ethical questions, the nature of humanity, and the relationship between humans and the cosmos. Written texts encouraged debate, interpretation, and theoretical exploration. Though often entwined with religious or political authority, this intellectual pursuit marked a shift toward critical thinking. Humans sought to understand causality, predict outcomes, and uncover principles underlying observed phenomena. Knowledge was both a tool and a lens through which to view existence itself. The pursuit of truth was not without risk. Challenging established authority, whether political or religious, could provoke backlash. Observations that contradicted prevailing belief systems were scrutinized, suppressed, or reframed to align with dogma. Yet even within these constraints, human ingenuity found ways to advance understanding, experiment, and document findings. The tension between innovation and tradition, skepticism and faith, would continue to shape the evolution of science and philosophy for millennia. Knowledge also democratized influence, though slowly. While scribes, priests, and scholars retained exclusive access to advanced learning, trade and urban life exposed wider populations to ideas, techniques, and practical knowledge. Farmers, artisans, and merchants learned empirically through experience, experimentation, and observation. This dissemination of knowledge enhanced productivity, facilitated problem-solving, and prepared societies for more complex challenges, illustrating that understanding the world was both a personal and collective endeavor. By the end of this era, humanity had established the foundations for systematic inquiry. Cities were no longer just centers of trade and governance. They were laboratories of thought, observation, and experimentation. Knowledge became inseparable from civilization itself, guiding agriculture, health, technology, law, and spirituality. The pursuit of truth instilled a new dimension to human ambition, not only to survive or prosper, but to understand, anticipate, and influence the forces that shaped existence. In embracing knowledge, humans discovered their capacity to transcend immediate circumstance. Observation, calculation, and reflection became tools to interpret the universe, manage societies, and envision possibilities beyond the tangible present. Science, philosophy, and scholarship emerged not merely as intellectual exercises, but as vital instruments of survival, organization, and cultural identity. Through knowledge, humanity learned to navigate both the visible and invisible forces shaping life, forging a legacy of inquiry that would echo through centuries. As cities grew, wealth accumulated, and knowledge advanced, humans confronted a profound realization. Despite all innovation and organization, the future remained uncertain. Wars could undo prosperity, floods could destroy crops, and illness could strike indiscriminately. In this precarious reality, the human desire to predict and understand what lay ahead became a central preoccupation. Prophets, seers, and diviners emerged across civilizations, offering glimpses of destiny, guidance, and reassurance. These figures occupied a liminal space between knowledge, spirituality, and power, reflecting the enduring tension between human agency and the unknown. In Mesopotamia, oracles and diviners interpreted the will of the gods through patterns in the stars, flight of birds, liver shapes of sacrificed animals, and other omens. These practices were not merely superstition. They were informed by centuries of observation, correlation, and record-keeping. Patterns of celestial events, seasonal cycles, and social behavior were meticulously documented, and predictions were derived from this accumulated knowledge. The line between science, intuition, and spirituality blurred, yet the result was a systematic attempt to understand cause, effect, and probability. Prophecy became a bridge connecting human experience to cosmic order. Rulers relied heavily on these interpretations. Kings sought divine approval for decisions about war, alliances, taxation, and construction. Priests acted as intermediaries, explaining omens and prescribing rituals to avert misfortune. The authority of both kings and priests was reinforced by prophecy. A ruler who heeded omens and succeeded was seen as favored by the gods, while disaster could be interpreted as divine warning. In this way, the ability to read the future, or at least claim to, became a critical instrument of governance and social control, intertwining politics, religion, and human ambition. Prophecy was not confined to elites. Ordinary citizens engaged with it as well. Rituals, offerings, and consultations with seers were integrated into daily life, providing reassurance and structure. Festivals often combine celebration with divinatory practices, linking communal activity to cosmic patterns. People sought signs in the natural world, sunsets, eclipses, or unusual animal behavior, as indicators of luck, disaster, or divine favor. The human desire to anticipate the future was universal, transcending social strata and linking personal experience to broader societal rhythms. Written records amplified the power of prophecy. Tablets and scrolls preserved not only predictions, but the outcomes of past events, allowing patterns to be analyzed and lessons to be drawn. Prophets could reference prior occurrences, reinforcing the credibility of their forecasts. In this sense, prophecy intersected with emerging historical consciousness. Understanding the past became a tool to anticipate the future. The meticulous documentation of omens and predictions represents one of humanity's earliest attempts to impose order on uncertainty. The psychological impact of prophecy was profound. Belief in omens could inspire courage, deter rash decisions, or compel cooperation. Conversely, fear of predicted disasters could influence behavior, trigger migration, or spark conflict. Prophecy shaped societies not only through guidance, but also through expectation, subtly directing collective choices and individual actions. The anticipation of future events created a new dimension of human experience, where decisions were informed as much by potential outcomes as by immediate circumstances. Prophets and seers often possessed significant social authority, rivaling that of kings and priests. Their influence extended across political, economic, and spiritual domains. Some were advisors to rulers, guiding campaigns and administrative decisions. Others communicated with communities, offering moral instruction and ethical frameworks. The credibility of these figures rested on a delicate combination of observation, ritual, charisma, and occasionally, the validation of fulfilled predictions. Prophecy became a powerful instrument shaping the course of human affairs, reinforcing social hierarchies and mediating between uncertainty and action. Omens and prophecies also contributed to cultural cohesion. Shared beliefs in signs, fate, and divine influence created a common framework for understanding events. Myths, epics, and religious texts codified prophetic practices, linking human action to cosmic order. Stories of foreseen disasters, heroic interventions, or divine warnings reinforced social norms, teaching lessons about obedience, humility, and foresight. By embedding prophecy within culture, societies cultivated a shared narrative that guided collective behavior and preserved wisdom across generations. Prophecy was not infallible, and failures could provoke crisis. When omens were misread or predictions failed, trust could erode, social cohesion could falter, and authority could be questioned. Yet even failure carried lessons. Humans refined methods, reinterpreted patterns, and adjusted rituals. Prophecy evolved dynamically, balancing observation, interpretation, and belief. It was simultaneously a reflection of uncertainty, a tool for control, and an expression of humanity's enduring desire to confront the unknown. Across civilizations, the desire to know the future intersected with broader intellectual and spiritual development. Astronomy, mathematics, history, and ritual practice all informed divination. Humans recognized that while certainty was impossible, systematic observation could reduce unpredictability. Prophecy, therefore, became both a practical strategy and a cultural expression. It shaped decisions, guided societies, and articulated the tension between human will and cosmic forces. It was a testament to the human need to seek patterns, meaning, and reassurance in an unpredictable world. By the end of this era, prophecy had become integral to the human story. It connected knowledge, faith, and authority, influencing decisions that shaped cities, empires, and civilizations. The pursuit of foresight reflected a deep human truth. Even as societies advanced in technology, governance, and trade, uncertainty remained, and the desire to understand what lay ahead was relentless. Prophecy embodied the hope that the future could be read, managed, and anticipated, providing both guidance and solace in a world defined by complexity and change. Through the practices of oracles, priests, and seers, humans confronted the limits of control while asserting agency over the unknown. The study of signs, patterns, and probabilities became a cornerstone of cultural, political, and spiritual life. In learning to anticipate, interpret, and respond to potential futures, humanity not only sought survival, but also meaning. Prophecy, in all its forms, illustrates a timeless aspect of civilization, the pursuit of understanding beyond the present, the search for order in chaos, and the eternal desire to glimpse the path ahead.